Hey guys, tonight we're crawling quite reluctantly into medieval daily life. And when I say daily life, I mean things so normal back then that nobody even blinked. Yet today would send most of us into therapy. Before we get cozy, take a second to like this video and subscribe if you enjoy falling asleep to historical chaos. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and whether you think you personally would have survived 5 minutes in the Middle Ages. Spoiler, you wouldn't. I wouldn't either. None of us would. But that's exactly what makes tonight's deep dive so soothing. We're learning very calmly just how lucky we are not to live in a world where bathing is suspicious. Medical care involves leeches named after saints, and the smell of the town square could strip paint. So dim your lights, tuck yourself into something soft that isn't made of scratchy wool, and settle in. Because tonight, we're unpacking 25 things medieval people considered completely ordinary, things so normal to them, yet so horrifyingly unnormal to us, that it's honestly a miracle humanity made it out the other side. Let's wander back into the century where toothpaste didn't exist, shoes were optional, and the number one cause of death was being alive. If you grew up thinking a long hot shower is a basic human right, the Middle Ages would treat you like a spoiled space alien. In medieval Europe, water was suspicious. Not in a don't drink the river, Gerald is upstream again way, but in a deep philosophical way. People genuinely believed too much bathing could weaken your body, open your pores to disease, and possibly soften your morals. Being squeaky clean was a bit suspicious. A little French, potentially sinful. You, however, don't know any of that yet. You're a perfectly average medieval person. You wake up on a straw mattress that smells like every decision your ancestors ever made. Your shirt clings to you. Your hair feels like it's been buttered. Your feet could walk into a room 10 seconds before the rest of you, and everyone would still know it was you. Do you bathe? Absolutely not. You change your linen shirt. Maybe. Eventually. If you're rich. Because in the medieval world, clean doesn't mean what you think it means. You're not aiming for fresh out of a shower. You're aiming for not crusted invisible mud, and no insects currently falling off me in public. Hygiene is a spectrum, and the bar is incredibly low. Let's start with the logic. Doctors of the day, men who confidently prescribed ground-up emeralds for headaches, had strong opinions about baths. According to them, a hot soak opened the pores and let bad air, bad spirits, and bad humors sneak in. You might feel relaxed, sure, but now your insides were wide open to mischief. Church officials weren't much help. Some suspiciously pious types decided that enjoying a warm bath sounded a bit too nice. If something felt good, it probably tempted the soul. So cleanliness perched awkwardly between physical health and moral danger, like a bar of soap balancing on a slanted wooden bench. So instead of washing your whole body, you are encouraged to do something much more respectable. Wash strategic pieces of it. Hands, face, maybe feet. In a basin, quickly, with cold water that somehow manages to be both freezing and murky at the same time. Congratulations, you're clean by local standards. That's not to say full baths don't exist. They do. They're just rare, complicated, and sometimes accidentally sinful. In towns and cities, public bathhouses pop up along busy streets. From the outside, they promise luxury. Warm water, steam, the faint scent of herbs attempting to fight the much stronger scent of everyone in town. From the inside, it's crowded. Imagine a big wooden tub the size of a hot tub, but with none of the filters, rules, or boundaries. Families pile in together. Neighbors join. At least one stranger who claims to be practically family slips in when no one is looking. The water begins the day clearish. By evening, it has seen things. You go once in a while if you can afford it. It's not cheap. Fueling the fires that heat the bathwater takes wood, and wood is expensive. You can't just toss whole forests into your personal spa, so your neighbors scrub their elbows in comfort. Someone has to pay. The experience itself is intimate. You hang your clothes on a peg and immediately worry that one of them will go missing. You step into the tub, trying not to think about the temperature, the smell, or the mysterious floating items whose origin you absolutely do not want to investigate. You scrub with rough cloth or sand, or if the bathhouse is fancy, imported soap that smells faintly of olives and bankruptcy. If you close your eyes, you can almost pretend you're in a medieval spa. Then someone's kid splashes you in the face, and you remember where you are. Bathhouses are about more than washing. They are where people gossip, flirt, strike deals, and occasionally pretend not to see their landlord. Men and women might bathe in shifts or separate rooms, depending on the century and the region. Sometimes it's all mixed together, which makes priests very nervous. Because of this, bathhouses become morally complicated. Are you there to get clean or to get into trouble? Church sermons begin to mutter about loose behavior and temptations of the bath. Some towns crack down, ban mixed bathing, or close bathhouses completely when epidemics hit. You, meanwhile, are stuck. You'd like to be less crunchy, but you'd also like your soul to remain uncondemned. It's a tough balance. If you happen to be noble, your bathing experience looks different, but not necessarily more frequent. The Lord's Manor or Lady's Chamber might have its own big wooden tub. On special occasions, weddings, holidays, the rare moment when the stench of humanity penetrates even noble denial, servants haul in buckets of hot water from the kitchen, one after another, dozens of them, each bucket strained through cloth to remove the bigger bits of mystery. Getting ready for a noble bath takes longer than the bath itself. You step in, the water sloshes. Herbs and flowers float around you, struggling bravely against the scent of damp wool and horse. For a few glorious minutes, you are enveloped in warmth and luxury. Then you remember everyone can hear you splashing, and half the household is waiting outside for their turn with the same water. There is no such thing as privacy. The Middle Ages doesn't believe in it. To stay fresh between these rare events, nobles rely on linen and perfume. Linen shirts and shifts are prized not because they're pretty, but because they absorb sweat. You wear them under everything. You change them as often as your budget and laundry servant allow. Outer garments rarely get washed. They're brushed, shaken, ignored, and occasionally smoked over a fire like a piece of jerky with opinions. Perfume is your emergency backup plan. A little scented oil on the wrists, a pomander of herbs around the neck, maybe a rosewater splash if you're feeling extravagant. These do not actually make you clean. They simply help everyone pretend. If you're a peasant, your bathroom is the nearest river, stream, or barrel of water that hasn't frozen solid. Full-on baths are rare, winter baths practically mythical. You might wash in a wooden tub on major holidays, or before important events like weddings, christenings, or seeing the Lord. The rest of the time, it's basins, cloths, and a deep belief that God wouldn't have invented dirt if he didn't want you to keep some. There's also the small problem of water sources. The same river where you wash your shirt also washes everyone else's shirts, and their animals, and their dishes, and their sins if the baptisms are happening downstream. The water is brownish, busy, and full of surprises. You rinse quickly, with the air of someone who's committed to health, but not attached to survival. Still, there's a certain rough charm in it. On hot days, children splash happily. Adults laugh despite themselves. For a brief moment, the medieval world smells slightly less like damp wool and slightly more like wet dog. It's an improvement. Soap exists, technically, just not the way you know it. Rural households make rough soap by boiling animal fat with ash or lye. The result is a gray, gritty lump that can strip grease, paint, and possibly your personality. It's valued more for laundry and scouring pots than for pampering delicate human skin. For personal use, people rely on mixtures of herbs, clay, and sometimes sand. Yes, sand. You rub it on to scrape away grime. If your face feels like it's been polished with a brick afterward, that's considered effective. Oils and fats are used too: goose fat, tallow, olive oil if you're rich or live far south. You rub them on, then scrape them off with a dull blade. It's oddly similar to modern spa treatments. If modern spa treatments took place in smoke-filled cottages while your neighbor's goat watched. Bathing your body is rare. Washing your hair is even rarer. Lice, fleas, and other creative forms of wildlife live rent-free in medieval scalps. Everyone has them. Children, adults, nobles, priests. No one is safe. Instead of pretending they don't, people just incorporate them into daily life. You comb your hair with a fine-toothed comb, squashing whatever you find. Mothers sit outside, picking lice from their children's heads while swapping gossip. Lovers flirt by complimenting the sheen of each other's hair, quietly ignoring the movement beneath. Head coverings help. Hoods, veils, caps, and coifs keep some dirt out and some insects in. Hair is often braided and tucked away, not because it's elegant, though it is, but because it's practical. The fewer loose strands, the fewer places things can live. In theory, if you're noble, you might wash your hair before big feasts, using special herbal rinses that promise shine, health, and fewer creatures per square inch. You sit while a servant pours warm water over your hair, catching it in a basin. It drips down your back. It feels wonderful. You will not experience this again for several weeks. When everyone smells, no one smells. Or at least, that's the theory. The medieval world is loud with odor. You live surrounded by animals, smoke, damp straw, unwashed bodies, and food that's always one hot day away from becoming a science experiment. There are no air fresheners, only incense during church, and the occasional bouquet of something that isn't rotting. Instead of trying to avoid smell, people categorize it. There is expected smell and worrying smell. Expected smell: sweat, animals, old cheese, wet wool. Worrying smell: rot, sickness, something in the village pond that definitely wasn't there yesterday. You navigate by nose, the way modern people navigate by phone. You can tell which house is brewing ale, whose pig escaped again, and whether the butcher's stall is safe today or an experiment in future plague design. Despite all this chaos, there are moments where washing becomes serious. Before certain religious rituals, hands and faces are washed carefully. Pilgrims heading to holy sites sometimes bathe as an act of purification. Midwives scrub well, lightly rinse their hands before assisting with births. Surgeons, to the extent they exist, splash water on their tools with optimistic enthusiasm. People do understand that dirt can be a problem. They just don't know why. You might wash before attending a feast at the Lord's Manor, not because of hygiene, but because appearing filthy in front of your betters is both rude and potentially punishable. You splash water on your face, scrub your nails, and for a shining 30 seconds, you feel fresh. Then you remember your only shoes are permanently mud-colored, and your one nice shirt has flour embedded in it from last week's bread disaster. Still, you tried. In medieval terms, that counts as glamour. Summer bathing is rare. Winter bathing is heroic. The air is damp and cold. Water freezes. Your breath forms clouds that look like your soul trying to escape. The thought of removing your many layers of fabric, which currently function as both insulation and portable home, is deeply unappealing. But sometimes you have no choice. Perhaps you fell in something. Perhaps you've become self-aware about the smell. Perhaps a relative simply dragged you to the tub and said, "For the love of all that is holy, wash." The water is lukewarm at best, heated in a pot that gave up halfway. The room is drafty. You shiver your way through the quickest wash of your life, making noises that sound like medieval spellcasting. When you're done, you dry off with a cloth that has never truly been dry a single day in its existence. You put your clothes back on, still slightly damp from the last time you wore them, and feel oddly proud. You are clean. Ish. Cleaner than yesterday. Clean enough that if you died suddenly, people would say, "Ah, it washed recently. Fancy." In your world, bathing is not a daily indulgence. It is a logistical ordeal, a social event, a medical risk, a moral dilemma, and occasionally an act of bravery. You live in a time where cleanliness is not next to godliness. It's somewhere in the vague middle, sharing a bench with superstition and cold water. And as you crawl into bed still a bit damp, still smelling faintly of smoke and herbs, you pull the itchy blanket up to your chin and tell yourself what every medieval person tells themselves every night. I'll wash properly. Next feast day, whenever that is. If you think sharing a room with a sibling was rough, medieval sleeping arrangements are about to make your childhood look like a luxury spa retreat. Because in the Middle Ages, the concept of a personal bed was as mythical as dragons, honest landlords, or someone bathing twice in the same month. A bed wasn't a piece of furniture. It was a communal habitat. A warm, vaguely lumpy island where humans, animals, insects, and whatever the cat dragged in all gathered each night for mandatory togetherness. You don't get to choose your bedmates. You barely get to choose your sleeping angle. You simply accept your fate the way medieval people accepted everything quietly, with dread, and while secretly blaming Gerald. Imagine this. The day winds down, the fire crackles low, and the room fills with that cozy blend of smoke, wool, dampness, and someone's feet. You stretch, ready to go to bed, which really means slide into the crowded human pile you call a mattress. Privacy doesn't exist. Comfort barely exists. But warmth? Oh, warmth is the one thing medieval people chase like it's treasure. You climb into bed, and immediately there's someone already there. Maybe 2 people. Maybe 5. Maybe a stranger you've never met before, who simply showed up asking for shelter, and now sleeps 3 inches from your face, like this is a perfectly normal Tuesday. And it is, because this is medieval Europe. And if there is one rule, it's this. If it fits, it sleeps. In fact, most houses have exactly one bed, and it's for everyone. Parents, children, grandparents, cousins, neighbors passing through, a friar who wandered in because he heard someone coughing, and sometimes the family goat who refuses to sleep anywhere else because medieval goats had strong opinions and 0 boundaries. You lie down. The straw mattress pokes you in 17 different places. Someone's elbow finds your ribs. A toddler kicks your kneecap with the strength of a trained assassin. The family dog hops up, circles 3 times, and plops down directly on your legs, pinning you like a furry paperweight. This is normal. Sleep is not so much restful as it is survival practice. If you think anyone keeps their hands to themselves, think again. The bed is a battlefield of accidental contact. Someone rolls over and steals all the blankets. Someone else breathes loudly enough to upset the atmosphere. The youngest child has decided that your stomach is the perfect pillow. The grandmother snores with the force of a rusty bellows. The goat is chewing on something suspiciously close to your hair. And God forbid someone needs to get up in the night. Because when one person moves, everyone moves. The entire bed shifts like a giant, disgruntled organism. You get jostled, shoved, kicked, and briefly suffocated by a wool blanket before the bed settles back into its original shape. Mildly uncomfortable chaos. If you're traveling, say, you're a pilgrim, a merchant, or just someone unlucky enough to be on the road, you stop at an inn. You imagine a warm bed, maybe a soft feather pillow. Wrong. You get a wooden frame stuffed with straw that hasn't been changed since the plague, and you share it with however many strangers the innkeeper can fit in without violating physics. 10, 12, who's counting? You crawl in carefully, because stepping on someone's face in the dark is something people remember. The man next to you mutters in a language you don't recognize. Someone's feet smell like expired regret. Someone else is hogging the only pillow, which is actually just a sack of grain pretending to be a pillow. If you're lucky, only 3 of your bedmates snore. If you're half lucky, none of them have fleas. If you're unlucky, the fleas have fleas. Because bedbugs are not pests in medieval Europe. They're roommates, permanent ones. They live in the mattress, in the blankets, in the walls, and probably in your dreams. You swat 1 in 5, more show up as backup. And everyone accepts this because medieval life is basically a daily negotiation with nature. Some inns offer premium sleeping arrangements, meaning you get half a bed instead of 1/10 of it. You pay extra for this, of course. Money well spent, unless the man sharing your half is a sleep talker, sleep farter, sleep thrasher, or sleep clinger. You're not allowed to complain. The innkeeper will simply say something helpful, like, "At least he's warm." Warmth is the entire point. Medieval houses are cold. Not a little drafty, cold, bone-deep, existential, teeth-chattering cold. Windows are tiny or non-existent. Insulation is a future technology. And the fireplace barely heats anything except the one person sitting closest to it. So people sleep together. Not because they love each other. Not because it's cozy. But because shared body heat is the medieval version of central heating. Family of 6? 1 bed. Travelers welcome? Also 1 bed. Unexpected guests? Squeeze in. Your cousin's cousin visiting for the night? Sure, why not? A priest needing somewhere to sleep? Yes, and he's taking the warm middle spot. And don't forget the livestock. Chickens sleep in corners. Dogs curl up anywhere they please. Cats claim pillow rights. Goats wander around the room like insomniac security guards. In winter, even cows might be brought indoors to keep the temperature above Arctic despair. If they're small enough, they sleep near the bed. If they're too big, they sleep behind a wooden partition, and you listen to them breathing all night like ovine roommates. You learn to treat animal noises as white noise. The snuffling of pigs? Normal. The clucking of chickens? Calming. The goat snoring louder than your uncle? Weirdly soothing. The cow shifting behind the wall? That's just rhythm. And then there's the nobles. Yes, nobles have big beds. Beautiful beds. Beds you could get lost in. Beds embroidered with gold thread and curtains, made from fabric so expensive it could pay for a small village. But you know what nobles also have? Guests, visitors, servants, attendants, political alliances that require sharing sleeping quarters to maintain trust and goodwill. And bed warmers, not the little metal pan filled with coals, though those exist too, but actual humans whose entire job is to lie in the bed first, so it's warm when the lord or lady arrives. You think nobles sleep alone? Absolutely not. There's always someone guard. Maid, friend, cousin, diplomat, personal cook, random noble's nephew, a poet no one invited, but who somehow appeared anyway. A medieval bedroom is less a private space and more a social lounge with sheets. Even kings don't sleep alone. Royal chambers are bustling with attendants who snore politely, guards who stand at the foot of the bed breathing heavily, and personal servants who are always just resting their eyes. Privacy is a myth. Boundaries are a myth. The idea of my side of the bed is the most modern thing you own. If you lived in the Middle Ages and somehow ended up sleeping alone in a room, you would be terrified. Absolutely horrified. Because a single person in a room at night meant something was wrong. Either you were sick or cursed or dying or about to be murdered, or you'd accidentally wandered into a noble's chamber and were about to be fined for breathing noble air. Humans don't sleep alone. Sleeping alone means danger. Families sleep together. Villagers sleep together. Travelers sleep together. Even monks share beds stacked rows of snoring holy men, trying to get 8 hours of peace in a world that offers none. When morning comes, you wake up stiff, warm, and smelling like everyone else. Someone drooled on your shoulder. Someone has stolen your blanket entirely. Someone's foot is planted firmly in your back. A chicken is roosting on the wooden bedpost like it owns the place. The goat is chewing your hair. The baby is crying. The grandmother is arguing with herself. The dog is stretching. Everyone is awake except you, and you roll off the bed like a collapsed loaf of bread. It isn't glamorous. It isn't comfortable. It is, without question, the medieval way. And as you stretch your sore limbs, shake the straw out of your hair, and prepare for another day in a world that firmly rejects personal space, you think the same thought that every medieval person thinks every morning. At least it was warm. Because warmth is survival. And survival is the only luxury medieval people ever truly had. If you've ever watched a toddler drink juice straight from the carton and thought, that seems excessive, medieval parents would like to introduce you to their daily breakfast routine, giving small children beer, not strong beer. Not the kind that makes you confess your sins to random furniture. No, something much more medieval. Small ale, also known as the beverage that keeps you alive, but absolutely ruins modern parenting manuals. You have to understand the logic. Medieval water was an adventure, a gamble, a microbial lottery with no winners. If you drank from a stream, you weren't hydrating. You were negotiating with parasites. Wells were sometimes safe, often questionable, and always flavored like disappointment. Rivers? Those doubled as laundry tubs, trash dumps, and occasionally a crime scene. So people turned to the one liquid they trusted to be clean. Beer. Not fancy beer. Not IPA. Not anything with notes of citrus, or a price tag that suggests you're paying for the brewer's midlife crisis. This was small ale. Weak, cloudy, warm, and about as glamorous as wet bread. The entire household drank it. And when I say entire household, I mean everyone. Parents, grandparents, farmhands, monks, pregnant women, literal toddlers, still learning to say words like cow or why does life hurt. Breakfast was a piece of dark rye bread and a mug of ale. Lunch, bread and ale. Dinner, soup, bread, ale. Midday break, surprised ale. Nightcap, also ale. Hydration was beer. Nutrition was beer. Childhood was beer. Picture the scene. It's early morning in a crooked little cottage. The air smells faintly of wood smoke, wool, and whatever the dog dragged home and is now proudly chewing under the table. Breakfast is being served. The mother ladles out porridge with the consistency of wallpaper paste. The father slices hard bread with the determination of a man fighting an enemy. And there, at the corner of the table, sits the littlest member of the family, maybe 3 years old, clutching a wooden mug almost as big as his head. He lifts it with both hands like it contains the secrets of the universe. He drinks. Everyone nods approvingly. This child is thriving. And genuinely, this was considered responsible parenting. Small ale wasn't designed to make anyone tipsy. It was mostly grains that had been boiled, fermented lightly, and left to sit until it tasted vaguely like diluted bread soup. The alcohol content was low, safer than the local water, but still strong enough to make you feel strangely confident about your ability to operate a plow. Toddlers stumbled often, yes, but toddlers already stumble. How much of it was ale, and how much was simply being alive in a world where shoes were optional and floors were uneven? Hard to say medieval parents didn't care. If the child was upright and breathing, that was a win. And this wasn't just peasants. Nobles did it too, though nobles pretended it was classy by pouring ale into goblets instead of wooden cups. Rich or poor, everyone was sipping from the same beverage because nobody trusted their water not to turn them into a cautionary tale. Even monks drank ale all day long. Picture a monastery, serene, quiet, echoing with the gentle shuffle of robes. And every single monk is carrying a mug at 9 a.m. like it's an essential spiritual accessory. If you visited a monastery brewery, you'd see more barrels than in a pirate movie, and more monks humming cheerfully while stirring vats of liquid bread. Children attending church sometimes brought tiny ale mugs with them because the sermons were long, the stone floors were freezing, and small ale kept everyone slightly warmer and moderately less grumpy. Imagine a priest preaching about the virtues of restraint while half the young congregation, including the toddlers, sipped ale like it was holy juice. It was entirely normal. Imagine being a medieval mother trying to get your child to drink something. You have two options: water that might kill him or ale that won't. The choice is obvious. And besides, small ale wasn't a treat. It wasn't a reward. It was survival. No carbonation, no sweetness, no refreshing chill. Just a warm, slightly sour, vaguely oaty beverage that didn't poison you. Toddlers didn't get buzzed. They got hydrated. Of course, travelers from other regions sometimes reacted strongly to this. Foreign merchants visiting England or Germany would walk into a tavern and see children cheerfully drinking mugs of ale before noon. Their reactions ranged from horrified to fascinated to quietly joining in because the local water tasted like sadness. Records even show foreign priests writing dramatized accounts like, "I was offered ale for the children, ale for the women, ale for the oxen. Verily, I feared they would baptize the infants in ale." And honestly, they weren't wrong. Ale wasn't just a drink, it was part of the economy. Brewing was a household chore. Every woman knew how to brew it. Every village had an alewife, the medieval version of a beloved neighborhood bartender. If your alewife made a bad batch, the entire community suffered. If she made a great batch, she was basically a local hero, praised like a saint, and occasionally asked to adopt a teenage boy who needs guidance and also more ale. But like everything in the Middle Ages, small ale came with complications. Sometimes it went bad. Sometimes it fermented a bit too long and became not small ale anymore. Children would take one sip, wobble strangely, and parents would say, "Oh look, he's walking earlier than expected." Sometimes it was brewed weak and tasted like sadness. Sometimes it was brewed too strong and made peasants cheery enough to start singing questionable love ballads at breakfast. But no matter the variation, ale was the liquid glue that held the medieval household together, literally and socially. Every major moment in medieval life involved ale. Birth, ale. Death, ale. Harvest, ale. Bad weather, ale. Kids fighting, ale for the parents. Parents fighting, ale for the parents. Guests visiting, bring out the ale. Run out of ale, panic. If your child said, "I'm thirsty," you didn't hand them water. You handed them exactly what you were drinking, because no one had invented juice boxes, and milk was for calves, nobles, and cheese. You didn't question it. You didn't debate it. You didn't Google it. You simply gave the child ale and hoped they wouldn't spill it on the rush-strewn floor already soaked in a mystery that didn't need identifying. Toddlers walked around holding mugs. Babies were spoon-fed ale-soaked bread. 5-year-olds could identify which ale was brewed on the feast day by scent alone, and 10-year-olds? They were already helping stir the brewing pots, proudly inhaling the steam like future brewmasters. To be fair, medieval children didn't have the luxury of fragile immune systems. They grew up with dirt floors, questionable hygiene, atmospheric plagues, and livestock that wandered inside uninvited. If drinking ale instead of deadly water was the trick to keeping them alive long enough to reach adulthood, then so be it. And it worked. Small ale wasn't a moral failure. It was public health. It was survival disguised as breakfast. And as you imagine this tiny child, dressed in scratchy wool, balancing a wooden mug with both hands while his grandmother critiques the foam, you start to understand medieval parenting perfectly. It wasn't about good choices. It was about the least deadly choices. And for the medieval family gathered around a smoky wooden table at dawn, ale wasn't a treat. It was their version of bottled water. Just warmer, cloudier, and occasionally containing mysterious floating bits no one dared question. If you've ever had a toothache so sharp you considered rewriting your entire personality just to escape the pain, congratulations. You already share something deeply personal with every medieval human who ever lived. Because nothing terrified people in the Middle Ages more than tooth pain, except maybe the person who is going to fix it. And by fix, I mean yank it out with the enthusiasm of a blacksmith removing a rusty nail from a barn door. Dentistry as a profession didn't really exist yet. There was no soothing music, no reclining chair, no tiny mirror on a stick. There was, however, your local barber. The same man who cut your hair, shaved your beard, set your broken arm, drained your blood, and sharpened knives on Wednesdays. A real multitasker. A Renaissance man, long before the actual Renaissance. Picture it. Your tooth starts throbbing. Maybe you tried ignoring it. Maybe you chewed on the other side until that side also began to protest. Maybe you attempted medieval home remedies, clove oil, herbal poultices, or biting down on a piece of leather while whispering increasingly desperate prayers. Nothing works. The pain only grows. You can't eat. You can't sleep. You can't even glare at your neighbor properly. You know what must be done. You walk to the barber shop. The barber sees you clutching your jaw and nods with a look of grim excitement, like a man who's been bored all week and is thrilled for a bit of chaotic entertainment. He ushers you in past the racks of razors, leeches, saws, and half-finished haircuts. You sit down on a wooden stool that wobbles with every heartbeat. He tosses you a rag. That's your napkin. There is no explanation. There is no form to sign. The barber simply asks, "Which one?" And you point. What follows is not so much dentistry as it is medieval strength training. He grabs a pair of pliers, actual iron pliers, the same kind he uses for metalwork on weekends. If he's fancy, he might have a specialized tool called a pelican, named for its shape. If he's very fancy, he has a tooth key, which works exactly like a corkscrew and is about as delicate as one. You brace yourself. He braces himself. The pliers clamp down with a noise that is not reassuring. Then comes the twist, because medieval extractions weren't just pulling. No, that would be too simple. They required a combination of pulling, twisting, pushing, and occasionally muttering. It's stuck. All while you attempt not to faint, scream, or headbutt your healer in the face. There is no anesthetic, no numbing gel, no calming lavender candle. If you're lucky, he tells you to drink wine before he begins. Not to clean your mouth, to clean your soul. To shut off certain parts of your brain that don't need to witness what's about to happen. He gives you a wooden stick to bite on. It snaps within seconds. And then, the crunch, the pop, the sudden, searing flash behind your eyes. The kind of pain that makes you briefly reconsider every decision that led you to this stool, this barber, this century. But then it's over. The tooth comes free, bloody and triumphant, held up like a war trophy. The barber drops it into a little jar, or tosses it into the fire, depending on his mood. You spit blood into a bowl that feels suspiciously warm. He hands you more wine. You take it without question. You could be missing half your jaw, and you'd still take the wine. And that was the good outcome. Sometimes the barber only removed part of the tooth, leaving the rest to fester like a medieval cliffhanger. Sometimes the root snapped off. Sometimes the gum tore. Sometimes he grabbed the wrong tooth because the patient was thrashing too much. Medieval dentistry was a spinning wheel of possibilities, and none of them were pleasant. People tried to avoid the barber when possible, so home treatments flourished. Some held a warm brick to their cheek. Some chewed mint, garlic, or honey mixed with ash. Some tied a frog to their jaw, because humans are creative when desperate. Others prayed. A few cursed. Many did both. There were more esoteric remedies too. Some believed that if you kissed a donkey on the nose, your toothache would go away. Others believed worm spirits lived inside teeth and caused pain, so they burned incense by the mouth to smoke the worms out. The only thing worse than thinking your tooth was infected was believing it contained tenants. And then there was the medieval version of flossing, vigorously rinsing with wine, not because it helped much, but because it made the screaming quieter. Imagine walking through a village market, chickens screaming, pigs trotting, merchants shouting, and suddenly you hear the unmistakable sound of a barber pulling someone's tooth. No one reacts. No one flinches. It's just background noise. Medieval ambience. Even nobles, who had access to better tools and slightly cleaner procedures, weren't spared. A wealthy lord might hire a traveling tooth puller who wore bright clothing and performed extractions in the public square like a circus act. Children gathered to watch. Adults placed bets on how long the patient would last before screaming. Humanity has always been a little unhinged. And the traveling dentist showman, he loved the applause. He'd pull teeth with flair, spinning the pliers, tossing the extracted tooth into the air, bowing like he'd performed a magic trick instead of inflicting trauma. But the poor patient? He stumbled home afterward, half delirious, clutching a rag soaked in wine and blood, mumbling something like, "At least it's out." Your neck might stiffen, and without antibiotics, the infection could spread until the barber sadly informed your family, "It has traveled too far." That was the dream, to get the bad tooth out before it killed you. Because yes, medieval infections were no joke. A tooth abscess could become a death sentence. Your face would swell. Your eye might close. Which is why people tolerated the barbers, the pliers, the corkscrew tooth key, the agony. Because pain was terrible, but death was worse. And so, generation after generation, medieval mouths were a battlefield. Each tooth was a soldier. Some survived. Some fell. Some retreated early via pliers. And everyone pretended this was normal. When a medieval person smiled, their teeth told a story. One of bread, hardship, wine rinses, courage, and at least one traumatic encounter with a barber who smelled faintly of soap and panic. And if you ever meet someone who says they wish they lived in the Middle Ages, just show them a picture of a tooth key. Then ask, very gently, if they still feel that way. If you've ever stared at a questionable sandwich in your fridge and thought, well, it smells fine, then congratulations. You already possess the kind of culinary courage medieval people needed just to stay alive. Because food in the Middle Ages wasn't a daily pleasure or a creative hobby. It was an ongoing gamble, a rolling of the dice, a whispered negotiation between hunger, hope, and whatever questionable object was sitting in a clay pot under a cloth that used to be white. Eating wasn't dining. It was survival improv. Picture sitting down at a medieval table, a rough plank, stained with the ghosts of meals past, and watching someone proudly place the main dish in front of you. It's a salted meat block, the size and flexibility of a brick. The kind of thing you'd throw at a burglar, not serve to loved ones. It's been salted, dried, hung, smoked, salted again, ignored, accidentally dropped, then salted a final time for good luck. By the time it reaches your plate, it has the texture of ancient parchment and the emotional energy of something that has seen too much. You don't cut it so much as negotiate with it. You soak it in water for hours, sometimes days, until it becomes less of a brick and more of an edible suggestion. And even then, you chew it like you're trying to solve a puzzle with your jaw. Vegetables, when present, are boiled into oblivion. Carrots, parsnips, turnips, all cooked until they lose color, structure, identity, and any memory of having once been crunchy. Medieval cooks believed that boiling something long enough purified it, which is interesting because most peasants' cooking pots doubled as laundry pots. Yes, it is indeed possible your carrot spent some time in a bath with your tunic yesterday. No one mentions it. No one wants to. And then there were the mystery ingredients. Every medieval dish had at least one. You never asked what it was. You never asked where it came from. Some questions were considered impolite. Others were considered dangerous. If the stew tasted a little unusual today, it was best to simply appreciate the flavor and not ask if anything in the village had recently gone missing. The local cook might say something like, it's got a bit more body this week. That is not comforting. Now, peasants didn't waste food. Nothing was thrown away unless it actively tried to escape the bowl. And sometimes not even then. Stale bread, perfect thickener for stew, bones, boil them again, and again, and again until the water tastes vaguely like hope. Rice? Unavailable? Avocados? Absolutely not. Peppers? Only if you lived dangerously close to a trade route and owned half a kingdom. For most people, seasoning meant salt, if available, or smoke, if you're lucky enough to have something to smoke. The real surprise protein source, though, the one no one talks about, was weevils. Yes, those tiny, crunchy, uninvited housemates that lived inside flour. You could sift them out, but that didn't always work. Sometimes your bread had a little extra texture. Sometimes your porridge crackled. Sometimes you stared into your bowl and thought, you know what? If I don't look at them, they're just protein. People were practical. You didn't waste perfectly good flour just because it was inhabited. If anything, villagers saw it as a bonus. More strength for the children, a mother might say, absolutely lying to herself. And bread wasn't the soft, fluffy miracle you know today. It came in tiers. If you were rich, you ate fine white bread, delicate, soft, almost suspiciously pleasant. If you were average, you got coarse brown bread that doubled as a weapon in emergencies. If you were poor, you ate black bread made from rye, barley, oats, and whatever else could be added without causing open revolt. Sometimes it was mixed with sawdust. Sometimes it tasted like failure. Sometimes both. Then there was fish, a medieval staple. If you lived inland, by the time fish reached your table, it had already lived a second life, reconsidered its choices, and begun the process of returning to the earth. Salt was supposed to slow decay, but salt can only do so much. A cod from the coast took days to reach the countryside. By then it had an aroma so aggressive it could legally be considered a weapon. People still ate it. They had to. And they convinced themselves it tasted fine. Let's not forget dairy, milk, butter, cheese. Fresh milk spoiled in hours, so it was usually turned into cheese that ranged from heavenly to, is this supposed to move on its own? Butter existed, but in such small quantities that families guarded it like treasure. If someone dropped a pat of butter on the floor, 3 people would dive to save it. Food safety wasn't a concept. Expiration dates didn't exist. If something smelled odd, people shrugged and ate it anyway. If mold grew on bread, they cut it off and kept going. If soup developed a skin thick enough to trap insects, they skimmed it and said nothing. Rich people had feasts, elaborate dishes like peacock, porpoise, swan, and things stuffed inside other things for no reason other than drama. But even those dishes often tasted questionable. Medieval cooks loved spices to mask old meat, heavy sauces to disguise strange textures, and elaborate carvings to distract from questionable flavors. A delicacy might arrive at the table looking like a dragon but tasting like regret. And the average person? They ate whatever the season gave them. If it was winter, meals were bleak. If it was spring, meals were hopeful. If it was famine, meals were, let's not talk about this ever again. So yes, food in the Middle Ages was half hunger, half mystery, and entirely a gamble. Every meal was a leap of faith. Every bite was a test of courage. Every stew was suspicious. Every bread had secrets. And every salted meat brick was a challenge you either conquered or died trying. And somehow, through all the guessing, the weevils, the flavor roulette, the accidental ingredients, and the culinary chaos that would shut down a modern restaurant in 5 minutes flat, people survived. Not comfortably, not joyfully, but impressively. Which tells you one thing. Medieval stomachs were built differently, literally. And if you ever think your cooking went badly, just remember, at least your dinner didn't fight back. If you've ever complained about a single mosquito in your room, I need you to sit down, breathe deeply, and prepare your modern soul for what medieval people accepted as completely normal. A daily existence so thoroughly blended with vermin that calling it an infestation barely does it justice. It wasn't the problem. It was a lifestyle, a community project, an entire ecosystem baked into the walls, woven into the sheets, stitched into the seams of clothing, and occasionally added, entirely unintentionally, to your dinner. Because in the Middle Ages, vermin weren't guests. They were roommates, permanent ones. The kind that don't pay rent, don't respect boundaries, and don't care if you've just cleaned. They lived with you, on you, in you, and despite you. Every medieval household, from humble shacks to stone castles, operated on the baseline assumption that anything soft, warm, dry, or edible belonged to at least 10 other species before it belonged to you. Let's start with the smallest, most loyal companions of all, lice. Lice weren't an occasional problem. They were a certainty, a guarantee, a universal shared human experience, a bonding ritual. If you had a head, you had lice. If you had hair thick enough to hide a single secret, lice had already filed a property claim. Medieval people didn't even blink at it. They talked, worked, slept, prayed, argued, flirted, and gossiped while scratching their scalps like it was simply part of conversation. Children scratched, adults scratched, monks scratched under their hoods, and knights scratched beneath helmets that already felt like torture chambers. Parents didn't inspect children for lice because everyone already knew the answer. The real question was whether you had the polite kind of lice or the ambitious kind, the ones who brought extended family. Removing them wasn't a battle. It was maintenance, a casual evening pastime. Mothers sat near the hearth, picking through hair with a small knife or fingernails while offering commentary about the neighbor's suspiciously large turnip crop. It wasn't disgusting. It was domestic. Fleas, however, were the true tyrants of medieval daily life. Tiny acrobats with Olympic-level jumping skills and absolutely no respect for your personal space. They lived in beds, blankets, boots, and tunics. They lived in rushes scattered on floors, and in the fresh batch of rushes meant to replace the old, filthy rushes. They lived inside straw mattresses, which were not so much mattresses as dense continental breakfast buffets for insects. When you went to sleep at night, fleas didn't politely wait for you to settle. They threw a party. They invited everyone. They danced across your ankles and feasted on your legs like you were the evening special. People slapped at their skin in their sleep, so often that the sound became part of the nighttime, ambience like medieval white noise. Even noble families weren't spared. Their mosquito-free summer castle retreats, filled with fleas, their velvet bed hangings, flea hotels, their luxurious furs, flea palaces. The only difference between rich and poor was who got to pretend it wasn't happening. Then came rats, nature's little landlords. Rats ruled medieval towns with the confidence of creatures who knew no one could evict them. They lived in walls, under floorboards, behind grain barrels, beside hearths, inside ovens, and in the cracks between stones. They were everywhere food went, which was everywhere medieval people lived, because food storage back then was basically put it in a box and pray. If you left a loaf of bread unattended for longer than 3 minutes, a rat would appear like a summoned demon. Leave a sack of grain on the floor? Congratulations, you've adopted a family of rodents. Try to ignore it. You'll hear them at night, scuttling, nibbling, gossiping loudly about your terrible architecture. People tried to fight them with cats, but medieval cats had their own opinions about labor. Some were lazy. Some were indifferent. Some staged early protests by leaving half-dead rodents as passive-aggressive messages. And some were too busy pursuing their true passion, staring ominously into corners and invisible things. Even when cats succeeded, rats simply reproduced faster than household faith. There was no true victory, only intervals of slightly fewer rats. Inside houses, vermin formed micro-societies. Fleas hopped between dogs and humans like traveling merchants. Lice colonized clothing seams with unwavering loyalty. Rats scurried across rafters as if auditioning for aerial ballet. And everyone accepted it because the alternative was despair. Even the most personal spaces weren't spared. Clothing, for example, could not be trusted. Wool tunics were warm, yes, but also the perfect environment for lice to set up multi-generational estates. Fleas loved fabric folds. Rats loved wool too, just not in one piece. People pulled on shirts with the unspoken hope that nothing inside was already biting them. Undergarments rarely washed, aggressively reused, accumulated layers of life. You could shake a garment outdoors and watch tiny dots spring away like seeds caught in a breeze. But beds, beds were a whole ecosystem on their own. Imagine lying down at the end of a long day of labor, expecting rest, only to feel the unmistakable vibration of something moving beneath the straw. Not superstition, not imagination. Something with tiny feet and an unapologetic personality. Rats nested in the corners. Fleas nestled in the middle. The mattress sighed with the collected efforts of 100 tiny jaws. Some people slept on woolen blankets instead, hoping it would discourage critters. It didn't. And then there was food storage, the universal playground for vermin. Barrels of grain became rat nightclubs. Flour sacks became flea nurseries. Meat hung from ceilings, supposedly safe from animals, but rats always found a route. Their philosophy: if it exists, climb it. If you can't climb it, jump. If you can't jump, chew through whatever is preventing you. Medieval householders added cats, dogs, ferrets, traps, and prayers to the mix. None provided permanent solutions. Rats occasionally chewed through candles, fell into cooking pots, or scurried across guests' shoes at dinner. Guests usually pretended not to see it. Hospitality demanded grace and lowered expectations. Even the outdoors wasn't safe. Barns, mills, outhouses, bakeries, and storage rooms all buzzed, scratched, or scurried. People walked through streets, brushing fleas off their legs. Long cloaks dragged across the ground, sweeping up vermin like macabre Swiffer cloths. And when plague outbreaks swept across Europe, everyone suddenly pretended to be shocked by how many rats existed, as if rodents hadn't been using medieval towns as their personal real estate empires for centuries. But the most medieval reaction of all wasn't terror or disgust. It was resignation. You didn't scream when you spotted a rat in your pantry. You said something like, "There he is again," and moved the sack to a higher shelf. You didn't panic about fleas. You shook your tunic, scratched your ankles, and blamed the weather. You didn't despair over lice. You sat by the fire, let someone comb through your hair, and talked about grain taxes. Living with vermin was simply part of life, like breathing, like taxes. Like Margaret, the suspicious neighbor, who always seemed to avert her eyes when rats crossed her doorstep. Modern people love to romanticize the medieval era: stone cottages, cozy hearths, horses trotting down sunlit lanes. But the truth is, every cottage hosted an insect circus. Every hearth warmed fleas. Every lane was a rat's thoroughfare. And every cozy blanket rustled with tiny passengers who believed they were the rightful owners. The miracle isn't that medieval people endured it. The miracle is that they endured it while still worrying about bigger problems: famine, war, weird weather, surprise diseases, wandering nights, surprise relatives, taxes that made no sense, and churches that insisted everything was a sin. And through all of it, people slept, laughed, lived, worked, and raised children while vermin treated their homes like bustling co-ops. If your modern self wants to know why medieval folk had such a high tolerance for chaos, the answer is simple. Because when you live in a world where every bed crunches, every cloak crawls, every flour sack squirms, and every ceiling beam squeaks, your bar for terrible sits significantly higher than ours. And so, day after day, night after night, medieval people lived shoulder to shoulder with creatures that modern society would consider emergency-level problems. Not because they chose to, but because in their world, irritation wasn't an interruption. It was the soundtrack. If you've ever had a bad doctor's visit, one where the nurse missed the vein twice, or the doctor Googled your symptoms in front of you, I want you to hold that memory gently. Cherish it. Frame it. Because whatever you went through, whatever frustration or embarrassment you felt, medieval medical care would have eaten that experience alive, burped, and asked for seconds. This wasn't healthcare. It was performance art on the edge of a cliff. A grand medieval tradition built on guesswork, folklore, half-remembered Aristotle quotes, and a deep, unwavering confidence that the human body was basically a bag of mysterious fluids responding to the moon's emotional needs. Imagine getting sick, just a regular fever, nothing dramatic. You lie down, try to rest, and someone says, "We should call the physician." You perk up in hope. Physician? Sounds promising, modern, professional. No. A medieval physician arrives not with a stethoscope, not with antiseptic, but with a bag full of knives, leeches, herbs dried sometime during the previous political dynasty, and exactly zero germ theory. He examines you by checking your pulse, sniffing your breath, and studying your urine with the same solemn diligence a jeweler uses on diamonds. Physicians loved urine, loved it, because to them, that was the map of your soul. He holds up a flask of your pee to the light, like he's about to toast it, and announces something mystical, like, "The humors are imbalanced," which sounds smart until you remember humors were a fictional set of bodily fluids medieval people believed controlled everything: health, personality, destiny, and possibly your chances of getting a date. The four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile were the medieval equivalent of astrology, except worse, because people didn't just read them. They were treated for them. Every illness boiled down to too much of something, or not enough of something else. It was the world's most confident misunderstanding. If you were feverish, your problem was hot blood. If you were sluggish, cold phlegm. If you were too lively, excess bile. If you were too sad, black bile. Every personality trait could be medically corrected. Feeling overwhelmed? Too much moisture in the brain. Feeling indecisive? Your spleen is embarrassing you. And how did they restore balance? By removing fluids, of course. Bleeding was the gold standard remedy. Their pride and joy. Their universal solution. It didn't matter what the issue was: headache, fever, stomachache, melancholy, sore leg, weird dream, heartbreak. Someone always suggested bleeding. You'd be lying there, pale and sweating, and the medieval doctor, without a flicker of irony, would say, "Let's drain some blood. That should help." It never helped. Sometimes it killed people. But it was tradition. They tied a band around your arm, pulled out a blade shaped like a small angry teaspoon, and sliced a vein with the casual confidence of someone cutting into bread dough. Blood flowed into a bowl, maybe a cup, sometimes several. They judged progress not by your improving symptoms, but by how heroic the puddle looked. If you fainted during the process, it was considered proof the treatment was working. If you stopped breathing entirely, well, his humors were too far gone. And leeches, leeches, the medieval emotional support animal. Doctors adored them. They believed leeches carried divine wisdom, a sense of which blood needed removing. You'd lie there in bed, feeling awful, and suddenly someone would slap wet, wriggling leeches all over your arms, chest, neck, and occasionally your face. Families kept jars of leeches, like modern households keep jars of cookies. Physicians traveled with extra leeches tucked into pouches like gummy worms. Imagine lying sick and hearing the words, "Quick, bring the good leeches." But medieval medicine didn't stop at removing blood. It also excelled in adding things no sane person would add. Mercury, for instance. Mercury was the medieval cure-all for everything from skin issues to mysterious pains to diseases we now know should never, ever be treated with anything metallic, liquid, and toxic. Physicians prescribed mercury ointments, mercury potions, mercury steam baths. They rubbed it on rashes, drank it diluted, inhaled it as vapor. If something was wrong with your body, the solution was to make it glow internally. People stumbled around sweating, trembling, drooling, and muttering, and everyone nodded wisely, saying, "Ah, yes, the cure is taking effect." Then came the herbal remedies. Sometimes they helped. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes the remedy was harmless flowers. Sometimes it was crushed beetles, ashes of burned feathers, or boiled animal bones. A few doctors prescribed powdered mummy. Yes, actual mummified humans, not metaphorical, not symbolic. Real mummies imported from Egypt, ground into dust, mixed into medicine, and swallowed with sincerity. If you were wealthy, you could pay extra for high-quality mummy, which didn't make it less disturbing. People genuinely believed ancient embalmed bodies had healing power. If nothing else, it proved medieval medicine was committed to being wrong in the most enthusiastic way possible. And then there were the treatments specifically designed to terrify you into health-like cauterization. Oh yes, disease, burn it. Infection, burn it harder. Wound, burn it thoroughly. Medieval physicians held a special love for heated irons, as if every illness was a goat that needed branding. Patients screamed. Families cried. Physicians nodded solemnly and said, "The fire purifies." That was their whole explanation. Fire fixes everything except the pain, the trauma, and the extremely high likelihood of making the problem worse. But nothing in medieval medicine rivals their theories about invisible forces. If you had a seizure, they said demons were shaking you. If you had chronic pain, demons were kneading you. If you had nightmares, demons were sitting on your chest. If you had a migraine, demons were knocking on your skull trying to get out. Diagnosing demons was practically its own profession. Doctors asked questions like, "Do the voices speak Latin? And does holy water sting?" They watched patients sleep, poked them with sticks, sprinkled ash across their mattresses to detect supernatural footprints, and instructed families to chant prayers, light candles, or place protective amulets over doorways. Every ailment was either humors or demons. No third options. Medieval medicine had two gears, leak fluids or banish spirits. Sometimes both, back to back. Imagine lying in a dim room, sweating from fever, and the local healer bursts in saying, "We need to bleed him." Then the priest arrives and says, "We need to exorcise him." They nod in perfect agreement. Meanwhile, you, half conscious, think, "I just need water." But of course, water was suspicious. So they'd give you warm wine infused with spices, honey, and something bitter that was probably once part of an animal. They'd wrap you in blankets, then unwrap you, then rewrap you, because the treatment changed depending on who last read which ancient text incorrectly. If your disease caused a rash, they applied ointments made from pig fat, herbs, and occasionally the ashes of old shoes. If you vomited, you were told the body was cleansing itself. If you didn't vomit, you were told the body needed help and were given something guaranteed to make you vomit. Doctors argued constantly, too. One said you needed more heat. Another said you needed less heat. One recommended bleeding from the right arm. Another recommended the left. One said the moon caused your symptoms. Another blamed guilt, envy, or the alignment of stars. And yet, with all their elaborate ideas, their rituals, their charts of humors, their jars of leeches, their pots of mercury paste, their powders of questionable origin, their cheerful application of burning metal, they never washed their hands. Not once, not ever. People who were sick were handled like bread dough, touched, poked, squeezed, examined by hands that had just cleaned a wound, fed a horse, skinned a rabbit, and possibly blessed a corpse. And somehow, through all of it, people survived. Enough lived to pass down stories, to have families, to laugh, to fear, to hope. Because the miracle of the medieval world wasn't medicine. It was resilience, and maybe stubbornness, and maybe luck. But mostly the miracle was that the human body tolerated all this care, all this misunderstanding, all this improvisation, and still managed, again and again, to pull itself back together. Because medieval medicine never healed anyone quickly. The people healed themselves slowly, clumsily, painfully, while the doctors confidently rearranged the humors, slapped leeches onto foreheads, sprinkled holy water in corners, muttered Latin, misread symptoms, and believed with absolute certainty that everything they did made perfect sense. And somehow, that confidence was part of the cure. In a world of pain, fear, and mystery, even bad answers were a comfort. Even wild guesses felt like guidance. Even the wrong rituals felt like care. And that was enough to keep people going. If you've ever lived through flu season, you know that faint sense of dread, the sniffles, the sore throat, the way everyone suddenly becomes an armchair epidemiologist. Now multiply that by 1,000, remove every scientific explanation, subtract hygiene, add a heavy dose of superstition, and stretch it across centuries. Congratulations. You now have the medieval experience of living with the plague. For them, plague wasn't a rare disaster. It was a recurring houseguest. Not the fun kind who brings snacks, but the kind who kicks down your door, steals your furniture, eats your pets, and leaves without saying thank you. Every few years, sometimes every few months, sickness would roll through the towns and countryside like a slow, dark fog, and everyone reacted exactly as you'd expect medieval people to react, with absolute panic, theatrical levels of superstition, and a firm belief that the wind was personally trying to murder them. The first sign was usually the smell, not the smell of sickness that came later. This was the smell of fear. People whispering, "There's news from the next town," or "The monks have written something strange," or "Old George saw 3 blackbirds on the roof." And you know what that means. Medieval omens had the scientific rigor of random emojis, but people took them seriously. And then someone in the village coughed. Not a big cough, just a cough. Maybe they inhaled flour dust. Maybe they swallowed spick wrong. It didn't matter. The whole village froze, stared, and mentally measured the distance to the nearest monastery, because monks always knew something, even if it was wrong. If the coughing person coughed again, louder, with a little chest rattle, a panic set in like a tidal wave. Doors slammed, windows shuttered, markets emptied. Priests started practicing their end is near speeches. Mothers grabbed their children and scrubbed them with whatever herbs they could find. Fathers looked at the sky like they expected God to issue a refund on the whole species. Because medieval people didn't know about germs. They didn't know about bacteria. They didn't know about fleas hitchhiking on rats. They just knew that sickness arrived like a rumor fast, messy, and impossible to stop once it started. Wind was the usual suspect. Not a specific wind, not a storm. Just wind in general. Medieval logic went like this. You breathe air and then you die. Therefore the air is trying to kill you. Entire medical theories blossomed around the idea that plague was simply malicious breeze. People stuffed herbs into their nostrils, hung flowers around their necks, burned tar in their homes, and waved little scented pomanders under their noses as if air itself could be negotiated with. A gust of wind rattled the windows? Bad omen? A warm breeze in winter? Certain death. A cold breeze in summer? Also certain death. A calm day? Suspicious. And the moment someone in town developed a lump, a fever, or a mysterious purple spot, medieval society immediately broke into its favorite pastime. Mass hysteria served hot and fresh. People fled the town, sprinting down roads with all their belongings in a sack, convinced they could outrun death. Spoiler, they couldn't. Others locked themselves indoors, barricading their doors with barrels, benches, and their own relatives. Some villagers outsprinted their morality, entirely abandoning friends, neighbors, and occasionally spouses, because plague brought out everybody's inner coward. Priests wandered through the streets carrying crosses, candles, and a face that said, "I did not sign up for this." They preached repentance, penance, and the idea that the plague was divine punishment for sins. Medieval people nodded solemnly, even if their biggest sin that week was stealing an extra onion. And then there were the plague doctor's medieval cosplay champions wearing giant leather bird masks stuffed with herbs. They waddled through the streets like ominous storks sent by a very confused god. Villagers whispered, stared, and kept a respectful distance, not because they trusted the plague doctors, but because anyone dressed like a deranged pelican probably knew something dangerous. Inside homes, families did everything they could think of to ward off the sickness, and medieval imagination was nothing if not enthusiastic. Some hung garlic on the doors. Others rubbed onions on their bodies. A few swallowed powders made from crushed emeralds, which did nothing except slowly poison them, but at least it felt fancy. Some kept fires constantly burning indoors, convinced that smoke chased away demons. Entire houses filled with smoke until the family inside was coughing harder than their sick neighbor, but they stayed optimistic. And don't forget the scapegoats. Medieval Europe loved blaming unusual things: comets, foreigners, the alignment of planets, or Gerald, who somehow always did something wrong. If the plague hit particularly hard, villagers looked for someone to blame. Accusations flew like arrows. Someone talked to a stranger yesterday? Suspicious. Someone looked at the sky too long? Possibly cursed. Someone had naturally rosy cheeks? Witch. Every outbreak had its own rumor wave. People whispered that plague demons roamed the countryside at night. Others said the earth itself was sick. Some insisted the plague was hiding in wells. A few thought it lived in clouds. And many believed the sick were being punished for moral failures. Laziness, greed, gossip, or dancing too enthusiastically at festivals. But beneath all the fear and superstition was something even more medieval: resignation. People genuinely believed plague was just part of life. Like harvest, like taxes, like rain. It came, it ruined everything, it left, and eventually it came back again. Children grew up hearing plague stories, the way modern kids hear bedtime tales. Old people said things like, "Ah, yes, the plague of my youth," as if it were a seasonal holiday they decorated for. When the sickness arrived, villages changed instantly. Streets fell silent. Inns closed. Trade stopped. Bells tolled far too often. People walked in wide circles around one another, holding their breath, clutching charms, and muttering prayers in languages they barely remembered. The dead were carried out quickly, quietly, often anonymously. Graveyards filled, mass pits were dug. Monks sang until their voices broke. Families grieved without answers, without closure, without knowing how or why any of it was happening. And yet life continued, stubbornly, absurdly. People still fetched water, still baked bread, still mended clothes, still laughed, whispered, complained, and told stories. Medieval resilience was strange and beautiful. Plague might steal their peace, but it didn't steal their routines. When the sickness finally faded, the world felt cracked and hollow. Survivors stepped outside like travelers from a long nightmare. The air smelled cleaner, the wind felt less sinister, and people blinked at one another with shy relief. They didn't celebrate. They weren't that optimistic, but they took deep breaths and whispered thanks to God, saints, herbs, charms, or anyone they thought might be listening. And then, slowly, life reset. Markets reopened. Bells rang for weddings. Children ran through streets again. People dared to hope until the next rumor, the next cough, the next bird omen, the next time the wind stirred too strangely. Because in medieval life, plague wasn't a catastrophe. It was a season, always on the calendar, always waiting, always ready to arrive uninvited, a reminder that the world was vast, mysterious, and terrifying, and that humans survived not through knowledge or medicine, but through sheer stubborn hope. And somehow, that was enough. If you've ever complained about a bad public restroom, or gagged at a suspicious smell near a dumpster, congratulations, you are not prepared for medieval sanitation, not even remotely. Because in the Middle Ages, sanitation was less a system and more a chaotic suggestion. Toilets didn't exist for most people. Sewers didn't exist. Plumbing didn't exist. What did exist was waste everywhere, and a society that collectively shrugged and said, well, that's nature for you. Picture a medieval street, not the romanticized version with cobblestones, charming lanterns, and a lute player strumming gently in the corner. No. Picture a narrow lane with uneven dirt, houses pressed so close together you could high-five your neighbor across the alley, and a smell so aggressive it could knock out a grown ox. The smell didn't creep. It didn't float. It attacked. Because everything, absolutely everything that came out of the human body went straight onto the street. People relieved themselves in chamber pots, which were basically small buckets pretending to be respectable. And every household had rules about when and how to empty them. Those rules were frequently ignored, especially at night. If nature called after sundown, you didn't walk downstairs, navigate the rats, unlock the door, and step into the dark. You didn't want to meet whatever was lurking outside, stray dogs, thieves, demons, or Gerald coming back from the alehouse. So instead, people carried their pot to the window, shouted a polite warning sometimes, and yeeted its contents directly into the street below. Imagine being a polite traveler strolling through a medieval town after sunset, appreciating the night air, when suddenly someone above you cracks open a shutter and dumps liquid horror onto your head. No amount of pardon makes that moment better, and the warnings were inconsistent. In many places, you were supposed to shout something like, "Guardy Lou," or "Watch the water," which is hilariously optimistic, because by the time the words finished echoing, gravity had already done its job. Sometimes people forgot to shout. Sometimes they whispered. Sometimes they shouted just for fun, even when they weren't dumping anything, causing innocent pedestrians to scatter like panicked cats. Now add animals to this mess. Because medieval towns didn't separate humans from livestock. Pigs wandered the streets freely, snuffling through piles of refuse. Dogs chased rats. Rats chased the dogs. Chickens strutted around like they owned the place. Horses contributed their own gifts generously and frequently. None of it was cleaned up with urgency. Rain didn't help. It turned everything into a medieval smoothie that slopped down the road, pooling into puddles so ominous that even the bravest knights stepped around them. Those puddles were not water. They were mysteries, liquid riddles, wet omens of respiratory illness. And don't think the rich escaped it. Even noble districts had waste problems. Castle latrines were just chutes that dumped everything down the outer walls, creating majestic waterfalls of misery. Servants swept the mess aside occasionally, but aside is not the same as gone. The smell lingered like a vengeful spirit. But let's go back to the cities, because that's where the chaos truly shines. Imagine waking up every morning, opening your door, and stepping onto a walkway lined with sludge from last night's window-based dump festival. The streets functioned like open sewers, collecting everything that households didn't want. People walked quickly, stepping on raised stones called stepping points, carefully hopping from one to the next, like they were playing a medieval version of The Floor is Lava, except the lava was worse. Street cleaners occasionally came through, scraping muck into carts, but they were never fast enough. Waste multiplied. Rain spread it, heat cooked it, and winter froze it into questionable sculpture. Now imagine children living in this world. Children, the same creatures who today lick playground slides for fun. They played outside, splashing, running, tumbling, chasing chickens directly through sludge rivers. Parents didn't panic. They said things like, builds resilience, and they weren't wrong. Those children probably had immune systems so powerful they could drink medieval water and walk away whistling. Speaking of water, no one wanted to drink from wells in dense cities unless absolutely desperate. The waste seeped into everything. Rivers near towns ran murky. Wells near markets tasted funny. People shrugged and said, "Must be the minerals," and kept drinking. If they got sick, they blamed the wind, the stars, the gods, never the thick brown stream that flowed past their doorstep every morning. But the real medieval terror wasn't just open sewers. It was the surprise attack of flying chamber pots. Because living in a medieval city meant understanding one universal truth. Anywhere, at any time, someone could dump their business onto your head. Think of the adrenaline. You'd walk under a window and feel the sudden silence. A shutter creaks. A voice calls something indistinct. And in that split second, you must decide run, dodge, or accept your fate. People developed reflexes. They learned to walk in the middle of the street, farthest from windows. They learned to listen for creaks, drips, and suspicious noises. They learned not to look up curiosity, killed more than cats. Community guidelines emerged. Some towns designated night soil hours, specific times when chamber pots could legally take flight. Some towns banned dumping during market hours because nothing killed commerce faster than a shopper getting hit by an airborne disaster. And some towns didn't care at all. It was every man for himself, armed with nothing but instinct and a hat thick enough to deflect the worst. But even this wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that medieval people were used to it. They lived entire lives walking through streets that smelled like a cursed stew pot. Babies took their first steps on floors covered in straw, meant to soak up drips from the ceiling. Couples strolled through alleyways as if they weren't surrounded by a biohazard zone. Vendors sold meat pies next to gutters where suspicious liquids gurgled ominously. And because smell wasn't fully understood, people didn't connect it to sickness. Some believed foul odors were spiritually dangerous. Others believed they strengthened the soul. No one believed they caused disease. So the stench remained accepted, tolerated, occasionally joked about, but never truly defeated. Yet somehow life continued. People laughed, worked, gossiped, fell in love, fought wars, planned festivals, and raised families amidst conditions that today would require hazmat suits. They endured their world with a combination of stubbornness, ignorance, humor, and surprisingly high tolerance for chaos. And every time someone leaned out a window holding a chamber pot, villagers quickened their pace, muttering the same universal medieval phrase, "Not again." Because in the Middle Ages, the streets didn't just flow with human waste. They lived in it, walked through it, dodged it, feared it, cursed it, ignored it, and somehow thrived in spite of it. Which says more about human resilience than any history textbook ever will. If you've ever looked at an awkward middle school couple and thought, they're basically children, congratulations, you already understand why medieval marriage customs would get every adult in the modern world arrested before breakfast. Because in the Middle Ages, romance wasn't a journey, or a choice, or even a feeling. It was paperwork, it was property, it was strategy, alliances, land rights, and the occasional, "We need another ox, so let's marry our daughter to the neighbor's son and call it diplomacy." And the ages? Oh, the ages. You think your cousin getting engaged at 19 was shocking? Try 12, or sometimes 10. Or, in several recorded cases, 7, which isn't marriage so much as two confused children being told to stand near each other, while adults make long-term plans using them like medieval chess pieces. Picture a medieval village. A girl is just learning how to spin wool, braid her hair, and avoid stepping in the street sludge. She's still tiny, barely tall enough to reach the bread oven without standing on a stool. And then her parents tell her, in the same tone modern parents use to announce a dentist appointment, "Well, dear, you're promised now." Promised because engaged sounds too cheerful for what is essentially a real estate contract disguised as a family milestone. She nods, because what else is she supposed to do? Ask questions? Express hesitation? Show feelings? Absolutely not. Feelings do not appear in medieval marriage negotiations. Land does. Wheat does. Dowries absolutely do. But feelings? No. Meanwhile, the groom is also a child, usually busy chasing geese with a stick or trying to avoid having more chores added to his day. He's told he has a future wife, and his whole reaction is something like, "Okay, but can I still go play?" Adults pat his head as if he's being sweet, when in reality, he's just unaware of the geopolitical responsibilities now attached to his existence. And before you worry too much, here's the part medieval people thought was responsible. The marriage wasn't always completed immediately. Sometimes they waited until the couple reached a sensible age, which was about 14 or 15. Because nothing says sensible like two barely developed teenagers being handed a household, livestock, and the expectation of producing heirs before they've even figured out how to grow facial hair. The nobility took this to even greater extremes. If villages treated marriage like an economic transaction, noble families treated it like a strategic war game. A 14-year-old boy could be married to a 12-year-old princess to secure an alliance, which is adult code for lock down the land and pray they don't fight about inheritance later. Kings arranged marriages before children were even born. Two pregnant queens would meet, exchange polite greetings, and mentally decide their unborn children should eventually marry so they could combine territories. The children involved? They didn't get opinions. They didn't get a choice. They didn't even get a conversation. One day someone told them, "This is your future spouse," and everyone expected them to smile gratefully. And let's talk about the romance, or rather the spectacular lack of it. Medieval marriage was not about love. Love was something that happened in courtly poetry, the kind written by men in velvet hats, complaining that the lady they adored refused to notice their lute playing. Love was a recreational activity for bored nobles, something to sigh about dramatically during feasts. Marriage was business. A bride's beauty? Irrelevant. A groom's personality? Doesn't matter. What mattered was whether she came with a field, some coin, a few cows, and a good wound. Whether he had a roof, strong arms, and the ability to not embarrass the family. That was enough. And the wedding ceremonies? Forget white dresses, heartfelt vows, and emotional speeches. Medieval weddings could take place in someone's backyard, in a churchyard, or sometimes simply at the village crossroads, because the priest was busy and the crossroads was conveniently located. A couple could literally marry by clasping hands, exchanging a few words, and calling the nearest witness to confirm. Boom married, no cake, no music, no bouquet. Just a lifelong commitment sealed with the efficiency of signing a delivery receipt. Wedding feasts existed, but only for the rich. And even then, the mood was less celebration of eternal love, more congratulations on merging assets. Please enjoy this roast swan while we discuss taxes. But the strangest part? Children didn't find any of this strange. They grew up watching their older siblings get promised off one by one. They listened to adults talk about dowries, the way modern people talk about school admissions. They helped prepare trousseaux long before understanding what a trousseau even was. Marriage wasn't mysterious or magical. It was inevitable, expected, and as natural as breathing. Yet, despite all the practicality, there was still fear, because children, especially girls, knew what marriage meant long before they were ready for it. A girl might be 12, but the village whispered about her future, about her duties, about the expectations placed on her body, her housework, her role as a wife long before she had finished being a child. A boy might be 13, but he was suddenly expected to be a provider, a protector, a man overnight, because marriage had been decided for him. And the emotional whiplash of it all? Spectacular. One day kids were playing with sticks and dirt. The next day adults told them to start thinking about their future children, which they didn't even know how to conceptualize. Medieval parents told their children, "You will grow into it," which is basically medieval code for, "You will figure it out because you have no other option." Imagine being 13 and handed a household budget. Imagine being 14 and expected to plow fields and maintain a marriage while still having a face full of pimples and the emotional stability of an unsupervised duckling. And the pressure didn't end with the ceremony. Once married, the expectations kicked in immediately. Produce heirs, maintain the house, work the land, keep up appearances. Ensure your spouse does not embarrass the community. Be an adult instantly. There was no finding yourself, no gap year, no time to mature. Marriage turned children into adults, ready or not. Not that the church helped. Priests constantly preached about the duties of marriage, lecturing kids who barely understood the birds and the bees that their union was sacred, binding, and absolutely permanent. Divorce? Absolutely not. Annulment? Rare and complicated. Running away? Forbidden unless you wanted half the village, forming a search party with torches. And perhaps the most medieval detail of all, the bedding ceremony. Yes, people watched the newlyweds get into bed. Not closely, not creepily, but symbolically. They escorted the pair to their room, tucked them in, said prayers, and left because nothing encouraged marital intimacy, like 10 relatives hovering over you saying, "Well, good luck." Eventually, of course, the kids grew older. They adapted. They learned their roles. Some even grew to like each other. Some grew bitter. Some lived parallel lives. Some found affection eventually, like a quiet ember that survived the storm. But none of it changes the truth. Medieval marriage involved children who should have been learning to read, playing in the fields, laughing with friends, and figuring out who they were, not negotiating dowries, managing households, or becoming parents. The Middle Ages normalized it completely. Today, it would trigger alarms, lawsuits, investigations, and a small army of social workers materializing out of thin air. And medieval villagers? They just shrugged and said, "That's life." Because in a world where lifespan was short, where adulthood struck early, and where survival demanded constant cooperation, marriage wasn't a milestone. It was a deadline. If you ever thought modern crime documentaries were intense, just remember, medieval people lived inside a crime documentary every single day, except there were no plot twists, no investigation teams, no forensic labs, just raw chaos and punishments, so theatrical they make horror movies look like gentle bedtime stories. And the most shocking part? This wasn't the dark corner of the law. This was the law. Justice in the Middle Ages was a community event, a moral lesson, a spectacle, and sometimes, let's be honest, a medieval excuse to watch something dramatic happen on a weekday afternoon. Imagine being a medieval villager. You wake up, stretch, step outside, and notice that the town green has a suspicious amount of activity. People are gathering. Stalls are being set up. The local ale seller is smiling like a man about to make 3 weeks' profit. You sigh, already knowing what's coming. Someone stole something again, or insulted the wrong person, or blasphemed, or maybe just existed too loudly near the bishop. Doesn't matter. Whatever happened, the punishment is going to be big, loud, and memorable. Executions weren't rare. They were as normal as markets or church bells. If someone committed a crime serious enough, theft, murder, witchcraft, treason, or just making the wrong noble angry, they'd get marched to a wooden platform right in the town square. No privacy, no build-up. Just you, the accused, and half the town watching with the same energy modern people reserve for season finales. Hanging was the classic. Quick, cheap, and convenient. Unless the rope snapped. Then everyone nodded solemnly and said it was divine intervention. And sometimes the criminal was actually pardoned because God had clearly given his opinion. Other times the rope snapped and they just got a thicker rope. Divine intervention was extremely inconsistent. Beheading was reserved for important criminals, nobles, high-status traders, people whose deaths needed to look respectable. But the executioner wasn't always good at his job. Sometimes it took multiple swings. People tried to act solemn, but no medieval person could resist a dramatic execution. And you can imagine the uncomfortable shuffling as the executioner muttered, "Hold still." Almost got it that time. A clean cut was considered an act of mercy, and also a sign that the executioner had gotten enough sleep. And if you think those were the worst punishments, sit down. Medieval justice had creativity. Some punishments were designed with the same imaginative flair as a fantasy novel, except far less whimsical and far more traumatizing. The pillory was a local favorite, a wooden contraption where you stuck your head and hands through the openings, leaving you standing there helpless for hours while villagers walked past judging you through snacks. People threw rotten vegetables, mud, insults, and occasionally surprise objects you absolutely never wanted launched at your face. Kids laughed. Adults lectured. Dogs peed on the supports. It was less a punishment and more a medieval social media comment section, except you couldn't log out. Stocks required sitting instead of standing, which sounds easier until you remember you might be there all day, while your legs went numb and your dignity dripped away like candle wax. People used you as a break from chores. Some even took the opportunity to lecture you about your moral failings while you stared at their shoes. And then came the punishments for more serious crimes, the ones that today would cause multiple international human rights groups to collectively faint. Branding was common. A hot iron pressed onto your skin, so everyone forever knew what you once did wrong. Imagine having a permanent medieval Yelp review right on your hand. Thieves might get a T vagrants an F. Some criminals had their ears clipped, noses split, fingers removed. Not enough to kill you, just enough to ensure everyone knew forever that you had messed up. Trial by ordeal was the Middle Ages running on pure chaotic energy. If the court wasn't sure whether you were guilty, they didn't investigate. Oh no, they handed the problem to God. You could choose trial by fire, water, combat, or some other dramatic method that sounded poetic until you actually had to do it. Trial by hot iron? Carry a burning metal rod in your bare hands and hope the wounds healed cleanly over the next few days. If they blistered badly, guilty. If they didn't, innocent congratulations. God likes you. Trial by boiling water involved sticking your arm into a bubbling cauldron, like you were making soup out of your forearm. Trial by cold water might sound gentler until you learned that the logic was, guilty people float, innocent people sink. Yes, if you drowned, you were innocent. If you survived, you were executed. Medieval reasoning was a labyrinth with no exit. And trials by combat? Let's just say medieval people believed wholeheartedly that God doubled as a wrestling referee. If two people had a dispute, they could settle it by beating each other until someone gave up or stopped breathing. Victory proved righteousness. Losing proved you'd been wrong all along, even if you were elderly or physically small, or had the fighting skills of a startled pigeon. Justice was less about truth and more about who had stronger arms and better luck that morning. Then there were torture methods used to extract confessions, which medieval courts treated like the ultimate truth serum. The rack stretched you until your joints popped. The stripado hoisted you by your arms tied behind your back. The boot crushed your legs until the bones cracked like firewood. Confessions obtained under pressure weren't just accepted, they were preferred. After all, who lies while being stretched like a medieval noodle? Everyone. Absolutely everyone. But medieval courts didn't care. And while you're sitting there thinking things can't get worse, they absolutely can. Some punishments were designed for maximum public spectacle. Burning at the stake for heresy, drowning cages lowered into rivers for certain criminals, even being sewn into a sack with animals and tossed into the water, a punishment that makes you wonder what medieval lawmakers were drinking and whether it came in very strong barrels. Yet the strange truth is that medieval people didn't think of this as cruelty. To them, crime threatened the entire community. Punishment wasn't just punishment, it was instruction. It was deterrence. It was entertainment. It was faith dressed up in iron and rope. You didn't hide justice behind closed doors. You performed it. Loudly, publicly, dramatically. Children watched. Merchants watched. Priests watched while muttering extra prayers under their breath. Even travelers stopped by out of curiosity. Everyone learned something, even if the lesson was mostly stay out of trouble or never steal bread while the baker is awake. And the accused? Some accepted their fate, some protested. Some delivered dramatic speeches that absolutely no one remembered. But all of them, the guilty, the innocent, the unlucky, became part of medieval law's strange obsession with making justice into theater. Then, when the crowd dispersed and the town square was eventually swept clean, life returned to normal. People went back to their fields, their chores, their feuds, their routines. Until, of course, someone else committed a crime or annoyed the wrong noble. The cycle began all over again. Because in the Middle Ages, crime wasn't just dangerous. It was a guaranteed ticket to the most terrifying show in town. And justice? Justice was loud, messy, deeply flawed, and absolutely unforgettable. If you've ever taken a sip of clean, cold water and thought, ah, refreshing, congratulations, you've already lived a life of unimaginable luxury by medieval standards. Because in the Middle Ages, drinking water wasn't refreshing. It wasn't healthy. It wasn't even neutral. It was a gamble, a dare, a liquid lottery where the grand prize was hydration and the consolation. Prize was a 3-day fever followed by your entire village debating whether you'd been cursed. Water back then was less of a beverage and more of a suspicious fluid you tolerated only when absolutely necessary. Imagine walking toward the village stream with your little wooden bucket, expecting serenity, maybe a few ducks. Instead, you're greeted by the full cast of medieval environmental hazards. A cow upstream, enthusiastically relieving itself. A pig wallowing like it owns the place. A sheep carcass lodged in the reeds. And if you're unlucky, and you always are in the Middle Ages, you'll find a vague, human shape floating face down, because medieval rivers doubled as trash cans, washing machines, public baths, and occasionally crime scenes. It's not that people didn't care about water. It's that they hadn't invented germ theory, sewage systems, or the radical modern concept of not standing in your own drinking supply while washing your feet. You approach the bank, ignoring the faint smell of despair and damp wool. The water looks clear enough at first glance, but clarity meant nothing. It could look like a mountain spring and still contain enough microbial chaos to start its own tiny kingdom inside your stomach. Some villagers swore by running water. It's clean if it moves, which sounds wise until you realize that everything unclean was also moving straight into the river. Others claimed wells were safer. They were sometimes, until a dead animal fell in, or a bucket broke and dragged half a rope with it, or some local rumor convinced everyone the well was haunted, cursed, or stolen by the neighboring village. And then there was the delightful medieval optimism. People believed water was safe if it tasted cold, or if it looked clean, or if you prayed while drinking it. Prayer did many things in the Middle Ages, but unfortunately, it did not filter parasites. Some families would dip their cups carefully from the surface, convinced that danger lived only at the bottom. Others drank from the bottom because someone once told them the surface collected evil vapors. Everyone had theories, none of them correct, but all passionately delivered, because medieval confidence was undefeated. Children drank whatever was put in front of them: river water, well water, puddle water, because hydration didn't come with explanations, just instructions. Toddlers toddled straight into the shallows, scooping handfuls into their mouths, building immunity or shortening their lifespan, depending on the day. Parents shrugged. You couldn't blame them. Everything in medieval life was dangerous. Why should water be any different? Travelers had it even worse. You'd stop at an inn, exhausted, thirsty, ready for a nice drink, and the innkeeper would slide over a mug of something translucent, murky, and definitely alive. Ask if it's clean, and he'd laugh. Ask if it's boiled, and he'd shrug. Ask for anything safer, and he'd proudly offer ale, cider, or mead, instead, because alcohol, unlike water, wouldn't kill you accidentally. Only deliberately, over time. Whole villages preferred beer precisely because water tried to assassinate them. Small ale wasn't a treat, it was survival. You drank it at breakfast, lunch, supper, midnight, between chores, during sermons, before sleep. A medieval adult drank liters of ale daily. A medieval toddler drank enough to shock a modern doctor. But everyone insisted, it's weak. Like that made it any less weird that kindergartners were mildly buzzed before noon. Compared to water, ale was the responsible choice. And yet water still mattered. Livestock needed it. Bakers needed it. Brewers needed it. Wives fetched it. Husbands argued about it. And the whole community hovered around its sources, like anxious guardians protecting both life and death. People blessed wells. People cursed wells. People threw herbs into them. People tied ribbons around them. People absolutely did not understand them. You couldn't escape the contamination either. Animals wandered freely. Chamber pots emptied into ditches that led to streams. Tanners dumped chemicals. Butchers rinsed blood. Washerwomen slapped dirty clothes right into the water supply. Bathing happened in it. Laundry happened in it. Baptisms happened in it. And somehow, people still bent down and drank from it like it was perfectly fine. Even when someone got sick, medieval logic didn't point to the water. Villagers blamed bad spirits, foul humors, curse winds, moral failings, or that one person with the shifty eyebrows. They blamed anything except the very obvious. The water looked like soup, but tasted like regret. If too many people fell ill at once, the entire village erupted into panic. Wells were hissed by throwing things inbred, herbs, coins, occasionally a live chicken, and waiting to see if the object floated, sank, or, God forbid, changed color. No one knew what any of it meant, but everyone pretended they did. In big towns, rivers were even worse. Picture London or Paris. Hundreds of people dumping waste, washing fish guts, scrubbing clothes, tossing scraps, emptying buckets of who knows what into the same river where children filled their drinking jugs. Some sections bubbled. Some foamed. Some emitted smells so powerful they could dissuade thieves and cure insomnia. And yet, the water was still used. Because what else were people supposed to do? Water pipes wouldn't be a thing for centuries. Filters wouldn't exist. Bottled water? An idea so luxurious it might as well have been sorcery. Royalty and nobles had more options. They demanded snowmelt collected in jars, or water shipped from special springs, or fancy infusions with herbs to mask the flavor of mild poison. But even they weren't safe. Expensive water was still medieval water. It just came with better packaging. And in monasteries, the closest thing medieval Europe had to a research center. Monks wrote earnest treatises about good water versus bad water. They described the ideal color, the ideal taste, the ideal mood of water. They believed water could be melancholy, angry, joyful, sluggish, or sinful. One monk even claimed water had personality traits. None of these traits included filled with bacteria, because, well, they didn't know that part yet. Sometimes villagers got lucky. A clear well, a fresh spring, a mountain stream far from human meddling. For a moment, drinking water actually felt safe. But those moments were rare, fleeting, a medieval equivalent of finding a parking spot directly in front of your house. Most days, drinking water was a negotiation with nature, with fear, with fate. You held the bucket, sniffed it, squinted at it, considered the risks, muttered a quick prayer, then drank anyway, because thirst didn't care about parasites. And somehow, against unbelievable odds, generations survived. Not unscathed, not entirely healthy, but alive enough to keep the story going. Which is the most medieval outcome possible. Fragile bodies, questionable choices, and just enough luck to see tomorrow. So next time you pour yourself a glass of modern water, clear, cold, clean, take a moment to acknowledge the miracle. No frogs, no floating surprises, no upstream cow contributions, no medieval optimism pretending it's fine. Just pure water, unbothered and unburdened. A luxury so normal, now it's almost invisible. But if you lived back then, every sip was an adventure. And not the good kind. If you've ever felt annoyed because someone sat too close to you on the train, or breathed a little loudly in your general direction, medieval life would have broken you by breakfast. Not just emotionally, spiritually. Because in the Middle Ages, the concept of personal space didn't exist. Not culturally, not architecturally, not philosophically. Privacy wasn't a right, or even an idea. It was a luxury no one had, no one expected, and no one thought was missing, because every inch of medieval life was lived shoulder to shoulder with other humans. Animals, sounds, and smells. Start with the home, or rather, the shared box that pretended it was a home. If you were a peasant, your entire living space could be crossed in 3 steps, 2 if you were motivated. 1 room for cooking, sleeping, eating, arguing, storing grain, hiding winter vegetables, and keeping the 1 chicken that refused to stay outside. Walls thin enough for a cough to echo back in harmonies. A ceiling low enough to punish tall people for existing. And of course, at least 6 other people sharing the room. Parents, siblings, cousins, the neighbor's child they forgot to pick up last summer, the baby who never slept, and a grandmother who had absolutely no concept of whispering. And if you wanted some quiet time, congratulations, that was hilarious. There was always someone nearby stirring a pot, patching a sleeve, stacking firewood, breathing noisily, complaining about the weather, or slowly realizing they were developing a medieval cough, which was basically every cough. Even if you tried escaping to the far corner of the house, you'd find the cat guarding a mouse hole and glaring at you for interrupting its shift. Sleeping didn't offer relief either. Beds weren't individual comforts. They were group projects. You didn't tuck yourself in you, layered yourself between siblings, strangers, and whatever livestock vomited warmth. Feet in your face, elbows in your ribs, dreams not your own. Every time someone rolled over, the whole bed shifted like a poorly constructed boat. Someone snored. Someone drooled. Someone stole the blanket and then swore they didn't. And someone always farted directly into the communal air supply, because medieval diets were ruthless and medieval nights even more so. Trying to sleep alone would have been unthinkable. Unsafe, selfish even. Privacy was suspicious. If you wanted time alone, people would ask what sin you were planning. And if they couldn't guess the sin, they assumed you were inventing a new one. But maybe you think the outdoors offered escape. A nice walk. Some space. Some fresh air. Absolutely not. Medieval streets were claustrophobia with a building permit. Narrow paths squeezed between leaning houses, their upper floors hanging over like they were trying to touch hands across the alley. You could walk through a town and accidentally brush 10 strangers without even lifting your elbows. People bumped, squeezed, collided, tripped, shoved, apologized, or didn't apologize, which was common, because medieval courtesy was limited and often optional. Vendors blocked pathways with carts. Livestock wandered freely. Dogs debated territory. Children ran underfoot. Someone's laundry dripped onto your hair. Someone else leaned out a window to dump something. And if you dared pause for 1 second, you'd cause a traffic jam of humans, pigs, chickens, and wheelbarrows. Markets were even worse. 1,000 people packed into a space designed for 20. Merchants shouting directly into your ears. Customers haggling by breathing their opinions into your face. Jostling hips, elbows, baskets swinging like medieval weapons, smells ranging from fresh bread to something that absolutely died. You couldn't even pretend to mind your own business, because other people's business was happening on top of you. Privacy inside the body? Also no. Medieval doctors happily examined you in public, poked your swollen ankle while 12 neighbors watched, and declared your illness loudly enough for the entire village to form theories. If you were a woman, midwives, mothers, cousins, and half the street attended your childbirth because privacy was impractical and gossip was free. And if you were a man, everyone in earshot learned exactly what kind of rash you had before you even finished describing it. Confession was somehow public and private at the same time. You whispered sins behind a screen, but everyone knew which sins belonged to which villager. Secrets didn't exist. Rumors were faster than pigeons. If you so much as sighed too loudly, someone across town knew about it before sunset. And then there were baths rare events that involved communal tubs, shared water, and attempting to wash yourself while maintaining eye contact with a farmer who absolutely shouldn't have removed his shirt. Privacy and hygiene was a future invention. You'd scrub your arms while a neighbor washed their feet a little too close, wondering which one of you was introducing new bacteria into the bath first. Even animals refused to give you space. Chickens wandered inside without hesitating. Rats considered your cupboards their living room. Goats stared at you with unsettling accuracy. Pig might walk straight into your home like it paid rent. Every creature in the household had the same amount of authority over the space. All of it. If you were wealthy, you had more rooms, but those rooms were filled with servants, apprentices, siblings, visitors, guards, cousins, and the occasional bard. Privacy meant leaning behind a tapestry and hoping no one noticed your feet sticking out. Even kings weren't alone. They dressed in front of attendants, ate in front of courts, slept with guards stationed steps away, and used toilets that were technically private, but acoustically not private at all. And let's not forget travel. Inns didn't offer personal rooms unless you were rich enough to rent the entire building. Instead, you'd sleep beside strangers, merchants, sailors, thieves, travelers with mysterious coughs, men who snored like thunderstorms, someone sharpening a knife at 3 a.m., and a guy insisting he was not a criminal while absolutely looking like one. If someone rolled over in their sleep, they rolled directly onto you. If someone talked in their sleep, they talked at you. If someone had fleas, you had fleas now too. Crowding wasn't just normal, it was survival. Warmth came from bodies. Safety came from numbers. Loneliness wasn't peaceful, it was dangerous. A human alone was a target for bandits, spirits, wolves, and their own imagination. Silence was suspicious. Solitude was risky. Space meant vulnerability. So you lived on top of each other, breathed the same air, shared the same noise, suffered the same smells, and navigated life like a single organism made of too many limbs. And the strangest part? People didn't yearn for privacy the way we do. They didn't crave empty rooms or quiet afternoons. They didn't imagine a world where a person could sit alone in a locked bedroom and scroll through nothing for hours. They couldn't even imagine what alone truly meant. You were born in a crowd, raised in a crowd, slept in a crowd, worked in a crowd, prayed in a crowd. Your life was witnessed constantly by family, by neighbors, by livestock, by strangers. Privacy wasn't stolen from medieval people. It had simply never been invented. And if you somehow found yourself magically transported back in time, craving just 5 minutes of peace, someone would inevitably walk right up to you, breathe directly into your personal bubble, and ask, "Why are you standing here by yourself? Are you ill?" Because to them, solitude wasn't comfort. It was a warning sign. If you've ever put on a slightly itchy sweater and thought, "Ooh, this is unbearable," medieval clothing would have broken you, so fast your ghost would still be scratching. Because fashion back then wasn't about comfort, beauty, or expressing yourself. It was about survival, social rank, and how much discomfort a human body could tolerate before screaming into the nearest haystack. Start with wool, not the soft, cozy, Instagrammable kind woven by ethical shepherds with gentle intentions. No, medieval wool was scratchy, stiff, and determined to exfoliate you down to your soul. Everyone wore it, rich, poor, clergy, farmers, your cousin who smelled like onions. Wool tunics, wool cloaks, wool hose, wool hats. You were basically a walking sheep, but itchier and less respected. And because spinning took forever, and washing took even longer, that wool wasn't fresh. It collected sweat, smoke, dirt, and whatever mysterious particles floated through medieval air. By the time a tunic reached adulthood, yes, clothes had lifespans. It had absorbed so much life experience, it practically had a personality. Layering didn't help. Under the wool, you wore linen. Linen that was never quite dry. Because medieval laundry wasn't a pleasant sunny day activity. You soaked your clothes in cold rivers, beat them with wooden paddles, hung them outside where birds contributed their opinions, and waited days for the fabric to stop being damp. Spoiler, it never fully did. Linen clung to your skin like a desperate ex. It chafed, it rubbed, it mildewed. It whispered, "Give up, you are mine now." And then there was the smell. You know how gyms have that warm, humid, faintly tragic odor? Medieval clothes lived in that scent permanently. Smoke from fireplaces seeped into fabric until every outfit smelled like a tired chimney. Sweat lingered. Dampness grew bold. People didn't wash their clothes. They aired them, which means they hung them outside and hoped the breeze would bully the stink into submission. It never did. Now imagine putting all those layers on your body. Men had to stuff themselves into hose-tight woolen leg coverings that were part pants, part medieval compression therapy. These things hugged your legs so intensely, they revealed every muscle, every scar, every unfortunate lump you inherited from your ancestors. Wearing hose was like trying to shove your legs into two angry woolen snakes that didn't want to cooperate. And women? They had the privilege of wearing dresses so heavy they counted as arm workouts. Layers upon layers. Chemise, kirtle, gown, maybe a cloak, definitely a head covering, sometimes an apron, occasionally a belt that served no purpose other than cutting into your stomach like a medieval reminder of pain. Then fashions changed, because medieval life enjoyed being difficult. Upper classes started wearing fitted clothes, tight bodices, snug sleeves, laces that made breathing something you did recreationally, not habitually. Tailored clothing meant you couldn't just pull anything on. You needed help. Dressing became a team sport. Someone had to tug the sleeves, someone else tightened the ties, and someone stood behind you, judging your posture. And don't forget shoes. Medieval shoes were basically leather socks. Zero cushioning, zero support, zero thought put into whether the human foot should be treated like something precious rather than a blunt object. If the ground was cold, your feet were cold. If the ground was muddy, your feet were muddy. If the ground contained rocks, congratulations, your shoes offered all the protection of wet paper. For nobles, fashion was worse. They wore fur-heavy, sweaty, nightmare-inducing fur, thick layers that turned people into walking ovens in summer and oversized bears in winter. Cloaks lined with squirrel, ermine, or fox made you look fancy, but also provided the thermal experience of slow cooking yourself. A nobleman could sit through a feast and sweat so aggressively the fur under his arms developed its own climate. Women wore elaborate headdresses, stiff veils, wimples, pennons, rolls, nets, wires, pin structures so complicated that a pigeon could land on your head and find enough stability to build a nest. If the wind blew too hard, your entire hairstyle could become a tragic medieval kite. And because fabrics were valuable, clothes were passed down through generations. You didn't buy new shirts every year. You inherited your uncle's tunic, your grandmother's apron, and that one cloak so old it remembered the Crusades. Clothes didn't just have stains, they had stories. And probably fleas. Speaking of fleas, clothing wasn't washed often enough to prevent infestations. Little critters lived in the seams, thriving in the warmth, forming entire flea civilizations with political structures more advanced than half the kingdoms in Europe. People dealt with this by shaking their garments, scratching constantly, and occasionally deciding that accepting their fate was easier than fighting it. And because washing was rare, repairs were constant. Torn sleeve? Patch it with another torn sleeve. Ripped him? Sew it crooked and call it rustic charm. Clothes were mended until they became tapestries of past mistakes, stitched together by mothers, grandmothers, wives, daughters, and anyone who could hold a needle without stabbing someone. But the worst offenders, the absolute champions of discomfort, were fashionable garments designed specifically to impress no one except other miserable nobles. Tight sleeves so narrow they required tugging tools. Buttons so tiny they tested the limits of human patience. Stiffened collars that scraped your jawline like passive-aggressive sandpaper. Decorative slashes that let your fancy undergarments peek through, but also let winter air slap you aggressively. And don't forget sumptuary laws rules, deciding who could wear what. Not based on comfort, but on class. If you were poor, you were legally banned from wearing anything nice, even if you found it in a ditch. Even if a noble dropped it traumatically like an exhausted diva. Meanwhile, nobles strutted around in outfits so impractical they could barely walk, sweating into brocade while peasants watched from the fields thinking, "You paid money for that?" Nighttime didn't help. People didn't have pajamas. They slept in their underwear, or if they were feeling brave, naked under wool blankets that had absorbed centuries' worth of secrets. The blankets scratched. The sheets were rough. The bedding often contained uninvited guests. If you moved too much, the sheets rubbed your skin raw. If you didn't move, you marinated in yesterday's sweat. And yet, medieval people thought nothing of it. Clothing was meant to endure weather, work, and the general hostility of existence. Comfort wasn't the priority. Warmth was. Durability was. Social appearance was. Your tunic could itch. Your hose could strangle your legs. Your cloak could weigh as much as a baby cow as long as it lasted. And because everyone around you was equally uncomfortable, no one complained. Except you, transported back in time, wearing a wool tunic so rough it could be used as sandpaper, sweating in a cloak lined with something that definitely died of natural causes, trying to walk in shoes that hated feet, and wondering how a civilization managed to survive while being poked, pinched, scraped, roasted, and suffocated by their own outfits. Medieval fashion didn't just dress you, it challenged you, and you lost every single day. If you've ever typed a symptom into your search bar and spiraled into a horrifying rabbit hole, congratulations. You already know more than a medieval doctor. Because in the Middle Ages, the person diagnosing your illness wasn't relying on science. They were relying on astrology, 4 bodily fluids, moon moods, the alignment of Mars, and whatever their barber casually mentioned last week. And worst of all, they were confident. Absolutely, terrifyingly confident. Imagine walking into a medieval clinic, a dim room that smelled like candles, herbs, damp wool, and fear. The doctor greets you wearing robes that look like they were washed during the previous dynasty. Around his neck hangs a leather pouch full of tools, none of which look remotely clean. Does he approach you with curiosity or compassion? No. He approaches you with a horoscope chart. Because to medieval doctors, your health wasn't determined by germs or nutrition or the rat that stared at you funny yesterday. It was determined by the planets. Feeling dizzy? Saturn is cranky. Stomachache? Venus is misaligned. Fever? Mars is bullying your bloodstream. Your medical outcome depended entirely on whether Jupiter was feeling generous that week. And then there were the humors, the 4 magical body juices medieval medicine revolved around. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. These liquids were believed to control everything. Your personality, your mood, and most importantly, why your leg hurts. If you were sad, too much black bile. If you were angry, too much yellow bile. If you sneezed, it must be your phlegm misbehaving. If you existed at all, definitely a humor imbalance. So you'd sit there describing your symptoms, while the doctor nodded wisely, stroking his beard like he was waiting for inspiration to descend from the heavens. He'd examine you by looking at your face, your tone, your fingernails, and most crucially, your urine. Yes, the pee bowl. Medieval diagnostics involved holding up a glass flask of your urine to the sunlight like it was a fine wine. Doctors sniffed it, swirled it, compared the color, checked for sediment, and sometimes even tasted it. They had an entire rainbow chart, explaining what different colors meant, most of which boiled down to, your humors are being dramatic. If the urine was pale, you were cold and wet. If it was dark, you were hot and dry. If it was cloudy, God help you. And if there were floating bits in it, well, then clearly the devil was involved. After all this analysis, the doctor would retreat to a big leather-bound book full of theories from ancient writers, who absolutely did not expect to be used as legitimate medical authorities 1,000 years later. He'd flip through pages, muttering about Aristotle and Galen like they were his co-workers. Then he'd produce your treatment plan, a mix of astrology, guesswork, and pure medieval audacity. The recommended treatments varied wildly. Feeling faint? Get bled. Trouble sleeping? Drink boiled hedgehog. Bad cough? Rub roasted mouse onto your chest. Back pain? Walk around with a bag of herbs tied to your belt. Nightmares? Avoid cheese and sleep with a blessed rock under your pillow. And bleeding, you couldn't escape it. Medieval doctors believed every health problem came from bad blood. So they drained you. They drained peasants. They drained nobles. They drained kings. If you walked into their office with a bad toe, you'd walk out a pint lighter. They used knives, leeches, cups, and occasionally anything sharp lying around. You were dizzy? Great. Bleed you? You were weak? Perfect time to lose more blood. You were near death? Quick. Bleed before it's too late. Nothing terrified a medieval patient more than hearing, "We must let the poison out," because poison meant any emotion, fever, sneeze, or complaint your doctor didn't understand. If bleeding didn't work, and shockingly, it often didn't, they moved on to purging. Vomiting, sweating, pooping. Your body was treated like a medieval house that needed all the windows opened at once. A doctor might hand you a drink made from wormwood, vinegar, or what he optimistically called medicinal mercury. You'd chug it, feel your organs protest, and the doctor would proudly say, "Excellent. The treatment is working." Was it? No. Did he believe it? Absolutely. And then there was the astrology timing. Medieval doctors wouldn't treat you unless the stars said it was a safe moment. If your appendix was bursting on a Mars day, that was unfortunate for you. The doctor would shrug, close his book, and tell you to wait 12 hours for the moon to move into a more favorable house. Some patients died because their astrologer Fission insisted the heavens were not accepting surgeries this week. The funniest part? Different doctors disagreed constantly. One might say you were too cold and needed hot herbs. Another said you were too hot and needed cold herbs. One blamed the moon. Another blamed demons. Another blamed your diet. Medieval people were caught between medical theories, like they were browsing bad WebMD pages written in Latin. And yet, despite the chaos, medieval doctors had the confidence of modern motivational speakers. They prescribed treatments with absolute certainty. If a patient didn't recover, the doctor didn't question his diagnosis. He questioned the patient's moral failings. Clearly, the patient didn't bleed enough. Clearly, they were possessed. Clearly, they angered the cosmos. Accountability? Never heard of her. The wealthy tried fancier options. They bought rare spices, oils, and powders imported from distant lands. Some nobles drank powdered emeralds. Some ate gold flakes. Some believed wearing a dead mole around their neck improved fertility. If it was expensive, it was considered scientific. Peasants, meanwhile, relied on local healers, women who used herbs, plants, intuition, and experience. Many of these healers actually knew what they were doing, but because they lacked university training and had the audacity to use solutions that worked, they were often accused of witchcraft. Imagine curing someone's stomach ache with mint leaves only to be told you were consorting with the devil. And if your doctor failed you, the church stepped in with exorcisms, prayers, holy water, and occasionally slapping the patient for emphasis. Because sometimes healing required spiritual violence. Not everything was disastrous. A few medieval doctors were perceptive, observant, even brilliant for their time. They noted that clean wounds healed better. They recommended fresh air. They noticed connections between food and health. But their voices were drowned out by the prestigious university-trained physicians who refused to touch patients and preferred diagnosing from a distance, while wearing long robes so fancy they tripped on them constantly. By the time your appointment ended, you'd likely be exhausted, confused, slightly lighter, smelling like herbs, and carrying instructions written in Latin that you absolutely could not read. You'd leave the clinic thinking, well, hopefully I don't die, while the doctor proudly prepared to diagnose his next victim. And the strangest part? Medieval people trusted these men completely. If the doctor said the stars demanded you drink oiled onion water mixed with goat fat, you did it. If he said your melancholy came from insufficiently cheerful blood, you tried to make your blood happier. If he said your illness was caused by looking too long at a bad omen, you carefully avoided suspicious-looking clouds. These doctors weren't evil. They were simply doing the best they could with what they had, which was bad information, limited tools, and overwhelming confidence in theories that aged like spoiled milk. You, transported back in time, would instantly understand more biology than the entire medieval medical faculty. You'd look at their methods, their charts, their bowls of urine, their leeches, their planetary diagrams, and think, my search bar could save this entire kingdom. But in the Middle Ages, having a doctor was still a privilege, even a disastrously misguided one. And so medieval life marched on bloodletting, stargazing, herb boiling, urine swirling, theory arguing, and doctorly confidence shining brighter than the sun, proving once again that in the medieval world, survival wasn't guaranteed. But enthusiasm absolutely was. If you picture medieval childhood as a sweet blur of playing with wooden toys, splashing in streams, and running barefoot through fields while singing songs stop right there, that fantasy belongs in paintings, not real life. In the actual Middle Ages, childhood wasn't a phase. It was a workforce category. And the moment a kid could walk without face planting every 4 steps, adults looked at them and thought, excellent. 2 tiny hands we can put to work. Imagine being 4 years old, and the first question you get in the morning isn't, are you hungry? But can you carry that? Kids went from toddlers to laborers faster than they learned their own names. Some literally signed work logs with an X because writing their name took too long, and the geese wouldn't herd themselves. Yes, geese. Medieval toddlers herded geese the way modern toddlers herd crayons. It was a common job because apparently nothing says sound parenting strategy like putting a 3-year-old in charge of 50 hissing feathery dinosaurs with knives for mouths. If you've ever been chased by a goose, you know medieval children lived in daily terror, but also built courage levels modern Navy SEALs would respect. A goose flapping at full speed toward a child is essentially nature's version of a medieval performance review. For slightly older kids say, 6 the job titles only got more ambitious. They fetched water in buckets nearly half their body weight, which sloshed everywhere, drenching their tunics and soaking their boots. No one scolded them for the spills. Adults just sighed, handed them the bucket again, and said, try not to drown this time. Kids learned quickly, not because of motivation, but because buckets were heavy, and villagers invented complaining centuries before inventing sympathy. And milzo, the mills. Children as young as 5 were shoved into flour mills to sweep flour dust, carry sacks, or retrieve grains from places adults couldn't reach. Picture tiny hands reaching into machinery powered by mules, water, or wind loud, grinding, relentless. One slip, one distraction, one curious check to see what that spinning part feels like, and the mill would deliver a harsh lesson in physics. But medieval childhood didn't include safety warnings. It included adults yelling, don't touch that, only after the thing had been touched. If the family lived near a farm, the jobs multiplied. Feeding animals before sunrise, collecting eggs from furious chickens who clearly resented existence, hauling hay twice their height, chasing runaway pigs who treated every escape attempt like Olympic sport. Kids were faster, smaller, and more flexible than adults, which meant they were perfect for catching anything that escaped. A pig the size of a small horse goes thundering past the house, and the adults barely flinch. They just point at the nearest 8-year-old and say, go fetch it. Were the kids scared? Absolutely. But the Middle Ages didn't make room for emotional processing. You feared the animals, but you feared disappointing your parents more. And so you chased the pig, dodging hooves and praying today wouldn't be the day you became a cautionary tale. Even inside the home, children worked. Toddlers fanned fires with little bellows until their arms felt like cooked noodles. 8-year-olds stirred pots taller than they were, sweating, coughing on smoke, and trying not to fall in. Kids spun wool, twisted ropes, scrubbed pots, and stirred vats of dye whose fumes could probably stun a grown adult. And if the child complained, even once, it was treated like a personal insult to their family, ancestors, village, church, and God himself. One complaint earned you a lecture about how your grandparents worked even harder. 2 complaints earned you chores added as punishment. 3 complaints, and a neighbor walking by would chime in about how children nowadays had become soft, despite the fact you were hauling firewood at an age when modern kids struggle to lift their own backpacks. Accidents happened constantly. Children tripped while carrying heavy logs, fell into mud, tumbled off carts, got kicked by cows, stepped on by horses, bitten by goats, and pecked by chickens who took their job of defending eggs far too seriously. A kid might limp home crying, covered in bruises and feathers. Adults barely blinked. They rubbed some herbs on the injury, wrapped it with cloth, and sent the child back out because the chores weren't going to finish themselves. And then there were the mines, thankfully not for all children, but for enough that history has receipts. Tiny bodies in narrow tunnels carrying baskets of ore up ladders in the dark. Dust in their lungs, soot on their skin, fear in their eyes. They worked beside adults who coughed black phlegm and said things like, "Keep your head down," which was both literal and metaphorical. Children were nimble, cheap, and expendable. Nobody said that out loud, but everyone acted like it. Markets also relied on young workers. Kids sold eggs, bread, herbs, and odds and ends. They shouted prices louder than you'd ever expect from a child missing half their teeth. They dodged carts, haggled with strangers, and avoided the occasional thief. Some children became little entrepreneurs, shouting, "Fresh bread, not stale, only slightly dropped." Adults found it adorable. Kids found it necessary because their family needed every coin. If a child belonged to a wealthy family, their work looked different but was still work. They practiced manners, needlework, reading aloud to adults, pouring wine, carrying messages between rooms, and standing still for hours during ceremonies, because nothing says noble childhood like becoming furniture. Noble kids trained for knighthood, which sounded glamorous until you realized it involved daily bruises, wooden sword whacks, hauling deer, and running in armor while adults critiqued your posture. A noble child's life was just labor wrapped in velvet. And all this happened before formal education. School, when available, wasn't a break, it was a second job. Children sat on hard benches memorizing prayers and reciting Latin while trying not to fall asleep. The teacher didn't gently redirect them. He whacked their knuckles with a stick so hard their grandchildren felt it. Falling asleep in class wasn't embarrassing. It was dangerous. There was no concept of childhood development, no idea that kids needed play for healthy minds, no understanding that exhaustion harms growth. Children were smaller workers with shorter legs, weaker arms, and fewer rights. But they adapted because they had to. Complaints didn't buy bread. Tears didn't produce grain. Rest didn't stitch cloth. If you misbehaved, you didn't get a timeout. You got more work. And if you did the job too slowly, adults assumed you needed more practice. So chores multiplied like gremlins. There was no such thing as being too young. If you were alive, you were old enough. And yet, somehow, medieval children found tiny slivers of joy between duty seconds stolen to splash in water, minutes spent chasing each other in fields, giggles shared behind haystacks, little rebellions like stealing a spoonful of honey or hiding instead of working. But those moments were rare and fleeting. The world didn't accommodate childhood. Childhood adapted to the world. So when you picture a medieval toddler, don't imagine soft blankets and bedtime stories. Imagine a 3-year-old standing bravely in a field, clutching a stick, staring down an angry goose twice their size. Imagine a 6-year-old carrying a bucket of water bigger than their hope. Imagine an 8-year-old sweeping a mill floor, coughing into their sleeve, trying not to breathe too deeply. Imagine children shaped by work long before they fully understood what work was. Because in the Middle Ages, childhood wasn't a protected time. It was an apprenticeship to survival. If you've ever dealt with a petty landlord, a difficult boss, or an HOA president who thinks flower pots are an act of rebellion, congratulations, you already understand medieval politics. Because in the Middle Ages, the most dangerous creature in your life wasn't a wolf, or a plague flea, or a goose with anger management issues. It was your local lord, not the king, not the queen, not some distant noble with a fancy hat and a fondness for velvet. No, the real power was the petty lord who owned the land you stood on, the fields you tended, the roof over your head, and by extension, your peace of mind. Imagine one man who controls your taxes, your work schedule, your access to resources, your ability to marry, and sometimes even your freedom to leave the village. Now imagine that same man having the emotional stability of a damp loaf of bread and the self-awareness of a rooster who thinks he invented sunrise. That's medieval feudalism in a nutshell. He wakes up grumpy, taxes go up. He wakes up cheerful, still taxes. He gets a new horse, taxes. He dreams about a horse, more taxes. But this time he tilts his head solemnly and calls it a riding levy. You didn't owe this man respect. You owed him everything. This was the Middle Ages, the era where nobles wrote laws, enforced laws, and broke laws with the same level of enthusiasm, and usually in the same afternoon. Picture a small village, 24 houses, a church leaning slightly to one side, sheep that escape daily, and villagers who've mentally surrendered to the chaos of life. At the top of the hill sits a stone manor where your lord lives, a drafty building that smells like old wine, muddy boots, and the haunting aroma of too much roasted meat. You wake up one morning to the sound of a horn announcing the lord's arrival. This is either good or terrible. There is no middle ground. Lords rarely drop by for social visits. When they appear, it's because they want something: money, grain, bodies for labor, or an audience to admire his new hat. The entire village rushes outside. People bow, children freeze, animals scatter, because even the goats know this is no time for mischief. The Lord trots into the square on a horse that costs more than your yearly harvest. He surveys the crowd like he's examining mushrooms at the market. Good villagers, he announces dramatically, due to the great strain upon my noble household, a modest increase in rent is necessary. Your jaw clenches. Modest means half your annual barley gone before it even ripens. But you don't argue. Not because you agree, but because disagreeing would be a swift ticket to punishment, fines, beatings, or public humiliation that becomes the newest village rumor. He continues, and also, I require the following: 2 men to repair my walls, 3 women to scrub the kitchens, 6 chickens preferably alive, but I won't be picky, and someone to entertain my guests with a juggling act. You look around. No one knows how to juggle. But that won't stop him. If a villager drops a chicken and chases it around while panicking, the Lord will consider that entertainment enough. Petty lords loved making rules. They collected rules the way modern people collect Wi-Fi passwords, frantically, randomly, and with no real system. In one village, a lord banned singing after sunset because it disturbed his meditations. In another, a lord fined anyone who wore shoes on Sundays because he wanted to see who was humble. There are actual recorded cases of lords charging peasants fees for crossing a bridge, not crossing a bridge, using a mill, not using the mill, marrying without permission, marrying someone the Lord wanted for himself, owning a pig, breathing too enthusiastically during church. These weren't villains in a fairy tale. They were just people, which was worse. Because individual people come with quirks, insecurities, bad moods, and bad ideas. Some lords believed they were philosophers. They'd deliver long speeches about duty and virtue, then immediately forget everything they said and demand extra grain to feed their hunting dogs. Some believed they were warriors. They strutted around in armor so heavy their squires had to discreetly push them up inclines. Some believed they were artists. They forced villagers to attend poetry recitals so boring that people prayed for thunder just to drown out the sound. And then there were the lords who believed they were chosen by God. These were the most terrifying ones. Because when someone thinks the heavens personally approve of every decision they make, even the ridiculous ones, they stop listening to common sense entirely. Neighbors whispered about these lords in terrified tones. He thinks angels tell him tax rates. He believes his shadow is a divine omen. He made Gerald carry a sacred rock around for a week. But even the more reasonable lords, rare but real, were dangerous simply because they could be inconsistent. A lord could be kind on Monday, merciful on Tuesday, and furious by Wednesday because someone insulted his dog. He could announce a feast, then change his mind halfway through and accuse everyone of looking suspicious. He could demand extra labor, then forget he demanded it, leading to twice the work for no reward. And let's talk punishments, because petty lords had full creative freedom. A noble could order a beating, a fine, a day in the stocks, or a public shaming ritual where the entire village stood around judging your life choices. One man was famously punished for stealing grain by being tied to a chicken coop while the Lord scolded him about moral poultry lessons. If you displeased the Lord enough, maybe you spoke out of turn, or didn't bow low enough, or accidentally stepped on his dog, you didn't just get punished. Your whole family might. Your children could be forced into extra labor. Your home could be seized. Your land reassigned. Your livestock taken for inspection, which was code for goodbye forever. And lords didn't need evidence to accuse someone. They needed a feeling. Medieval justice was less law and order, more, I woke up irritated and decided you're guilty. People learned to survive by becoming experts in reading noble moods. The way the Lord dismounted his horse could tell you whether taxes were rising. The tone in his voice told you whether a feast or punishment was coming. A badly timed compliment could earn you a favor. A badly timed joke could earn you a night in the stocks. And still, despite all the fear, peasants had to be polite, smiling, bowing, offering gifts from their already empty pockets. Because when someone controls your survival, your best weapon is manners, or quiet endurance, or whispered curses into the hayloft after dark. Yet every villager shared the same small hope that maybe, just maybe, this year the Lord would forget to increase taxes, or forget you existed. Because sometimes the greatest mercy was simply being unnoticed. So when you imagine medieval life, don't picture knights and tournaments. Picture a village holding its breath every time the Lord's horse trotted into view. Picture a man with too much power and too little accountability. Picture peasants praying, not for good harvests, but for their Lord to wake up in a good mood. Because in the Middle Ages, survival wasn't just about food or sickness or weather. It was surviving the whims of the man on the hill. If you've ever complained about potholes, buckle up or don't, because medieval roads didn't have seatbelts, rails, or even the faintest understanding of basic stability. Traveling in the Middle Ages wasn't a peaceful stroll or a scenic wagon ride. It was a full-contact survival challenge, equal parts mud, chaos, and spiritual reflection, mainly because you didn't know if you'd make it to the next village, alive, or whether the local bridge was still standing or had given up on life during last night's rain. In a medieval world, the moment you decided to go somewhere, you had already made your first mistake. Peasants stayed put for a reason. Roads weren't just bad, they were actively hostile. They didn't want to be crossed. They didn't even want to be looked at. They were long, uneven trenches carved by wagon wheels, hoofprints, and centuries of erosion, turning every trip into an unsupervised obstacle course. Start with the mud. Medieval mud was not modern mud. This wasn't a little brown puddle you hop over while complaining about your shoes. This mud was deep, cold, life-changing mud. It had ambitions. It had personality. You'd be walking along and suddenly sink up to your ankles, then your knees, and sometimes, if the road was in a particularly dramatic mood, up to your waist. Entire carts disappeared in that mud, swallowed like snacks, never to be seen again. Horses lost their shoes in it. Travelers lost their faith. Imagine trudging with a sack of barley, only to hear that terrible suction sound behind you as the earth tries to repossess your boots. Travelers wrote stories about boots lost forever to mud, as if the ground had its own private collection and no intention of giving anything back. Then there were the puddles dark, still pools that looked harmless, until you stepped into one and discovered it was roughly the depth of a grief pit. Medieval people learned fast. Puddles weren't puddles. They were traps. They were portals to the underworld. They were nature's way of saying, "Turn around, fool." And if the mud didn't get you, the bandits would. Medieval robbers didn't lurk. They waited, patiently, like cats who knew their prey eventually had to pass through the one shortcut in the forest. Travel in groups? Robbers loved that. More pockets to empty. Traveling alone? Congratulations, you've entered their preferred difficulty setting. Robbers weren't subtle. They'd jump out from behind trees, from behind rocks, from under bridges. They carried clubs, knives, and an unearned sense of dramatic timing. You could hear them before you saw them, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, or the awkward clearing of a throat, as the new guy tried to remember his intimidating line. Even worse, sometimes the robbers weren't robbers. They were the guards you were supposed to trust. Because medieval towns hired watchmen who sometimes watched, sometimes slept, and sometimes decided to supplement their income by robbing travelers on their day off. If you complained, they'd shrug and say, "Times are hard." And honestly, they weren't wrong. Travelers developed a sixth sense. You'd be walking through the woods and suddenly feel the hair rise on your arms, the universal medieval sign for someone wants your wallet, your shoes, or your entire horse. Speaking of horses, medieval animals did not behave. Your horse might decide halfway through the trip that a shadow on the road was a demon and bolt into the trees. Or it might simply refuse to move, leaving you to drag it like a stubborn cow that had just discovered existential dread. Wild animals were another problem. Wolves watched from the tree line, judging your life choices. Boars charged because boars had no chill. Bears occasionally wandered into the road and stared with the blank, heavy annoyance of a creature who was one poorly timed crunch away from changing your life forever. And then we have bridges. Medieval bridges were not feats of engineering. They were feats of hope. Wood rotted. Stones slipped. Whole sections crumbled without warning. You'd step onto a bridge and hear a creak along, mournful creak that made you reconsider every bad decision you'd ever made. People crossed bridges like they were walking into judgment. Slow, cautious, praying the planks didn't snap under their weight. Some bridges tilted at odd angles like a drunken spine. Others were so narrow they forced you to shuffle sideways, clutching your belongings like a medieval crab. Wagons would attempt to cross and immediately regret it. Wheels got stuck between boards. Axles splintered. Travelers pushed, pulled, cursed, cried, begged the river not to laugh, then pushed again. There are chronicles of entire caravans turning around because the bridge guardian, a very old man with no teeth and a stick, announced, "She's feeling fragile today." And of course, weather. Rain transformed every path into a muddy death canal. Snow hid holes the size of a small grave. Wind snapped wagon covers and turned cloaks into sails. Travelers leaned into gales like human scarecrows, trying not to be blown off the road. Medieval travel in winter? Only if you had a death wish or owed someone money and needed to vanish for a while. Fog was the worst. Thick, heavy fog that swallowed the world whole. In fog, the road disappeared. The trees turned into monsters. The silence felt loaded. Travelers huddled together, whispering prayers and checking the shadows for wolves. If you heard footsteps behind you, you couldn't tell if it was a horse, a person, or something that didn't want to be named. Then there were the marshes. Medieval maps didn't always label them, usually because the mapmaker had never left his village and confidently invented half the geography. 1 minute you're walking on solid ground, the next you're sinking in swamp muck. It smells like old stew and broken dreams. People got trapped and had to be dragged out by friends, or, in some cases, by annoyed strangers passing by with ropes. Even when you reached a village, arriving didn't mean safety. You might face toll collectors with questionable math skills, or get yelled at for stepping on someone's goats, or discover the tavern was full, and the only room available was a hayloft inhabited by a chicken with personal space issues. But for all the danger, medieval people still traveled. For fairs, for trade, for pilgrimages, for weddings, for messages carried on foot, because medieval postal service was just find a guy and hope he doesn't die. They traveled because they had to, because life didn't come to them. They trudged to meet it. Every journey was a gamble. Every path held a surprise. And every traveler who made it home gained the right to tell the story with dramatic pauses and embellishments, because honestly, they earned it. So the next time you hit a pothole or complain about slow traffic, remember, at least the road isn't trying to swallow you whole, rob you blind, throw a wolf at you, collapse under your feet, or lure you into a swamp. Medieval roads had one goal: to test your will to live, and they were very, very good at it. The medieval home was a place you returned to for shelter, warmth, and comfort, at least in theory. In reality, stepping inside your house was like stepping into a challenge you never signed up for. Forget modern worries like dust or a squeaky fan. A medieval house greeted you with a wall of smoke, a bouquet of mysterious scents, and the creeping suspicion that the building itself was trying to cultivate new life forms in its corners. Most homes didn't have chimneys, because chimneys were expensive luxuries reserved for nobles, monasteries, and the kind of people who owned more than one chair. The average villager simply had a fire pit in the middle of the room and vibes. If you asked, where does the smoke go? The medieval answer was, up, and if you pressed for details, they'd gesture vaguely toward the roof, which may or may not have had a hole, depending on how generous the season had been. So the smoke didn't go up. It went everywhere. It filled the rafters, clung to the beams, soaked into clothing, cooked itself into the thatch, and settled into your lungs like an unwelcome tenant. Every breath felt like inhaling a campfire that had opinions. Eyes watered constantly. Children cried. Adults blinked through the haze like philosophical raccoons. Everything looked like a permanent foggy morning, even at noon. Visitors would walk in, wave their hands in front of their faces, and politely cough while saying things like, "Ah, you've been keeping the fire warm," which was medieval code for, "I can't see your furniture, and I'm praying not to trip over something alive." The scent inside a home was complex. Medieval smells didn't follow rules. They layered. Smoke mixed with damp wool mixed with drying herbs mixed with yesterday's stew, which mixed with last week's stew, which mixed with the smell of leather, sweat, and whatever creature had decided to nap indoors without asking. Everything smelled faintly of effort and despair. Even outside there was no escape, because the scent clung to hair, clothes, and personalities. Travelers who walked into towns could identify which village someone came from based on the dominant note of ode to suffering hanging around them. Then there was the mold. Mold wasn't an occasional nuisance. It was a roommate, a permanent resident, a tenant who paid rent in spores. Walls, beams, bedding, clothing, ropes, cheese. Every object had at least one species of mold quietly thriving on it. Medieval people didn't ask, "Is that safe?" They asked, "Is it spreading fast?" Homes leaked constantly. Roofs dripped in winter, sweated in summer, and groaned under snow like they were reconsidering their career choices. Rain didn't politely stay outside. It came in. It trickled down walls, collected in corners, soaked bedding, and helped mold colonies establish new franchises. Medieval families developed the skill of shifting sleeping spaces at the sound of a new drip, like nomads navigating weather pockets inside their own home. And because houses were built with wattle and daub, a delicate blend of mud, sticks and hope walls cracked, shifted, and occasionally crumbled, letting in breezes, insects, and whatever animal decided to climb in for warmth. Speaking of animals, the medieval home was a community project in the worst possible way. Chickens wandered in and out like freeloading guests. Cats prowled the rafters. Dogs snored by the fire. Goats stuck their heads through the door at all hours. In some cases, a cow lived inside for winter, chewing cud and contributing generously to the ongoing mystery smell problem. And because all these creatures had opinions about personal hygiene, the house never smelled like just one thing. It smelled like everything trying to coexist at once. When medieval people described a home as lively, they meant it literally. But the real star of the indoor chaos was the smoke. Smoke ruled the house. It curled around beams, clung to hair, and turned every cooking session into a vision test. Medieval families crouched near the fire like cave dwellers, poking at pots and pans with streaming eyes and resigned expressions. Children learned early on that if you wandered too far from the fire, the cold would get you, and if you got too close, the smoke would set your lungs on fire. There was no such thing as ventilation. Windows were small, sealed with oiled cloth or thin horn, letting in just enough light to illuminate the smoke, but not enough fresh air to fix the problem. Opening a door helped, briefly, until wind blew sparks into someone's blanket or set a straw mat aflame. Medieval life was essentially a long series of quiet negotiations with fire. And the coughing, the coughing. A medieval family sounded like a choir of bronchial geese. People hacked through dinner, wheezed through conversation, and thanked God for every breath that didn't feel like inhaling a burning shrub. Chronic cough wasn't a symptom, it was a lifestyle. Then there were the smells no one discussed, the unidentifiable ones, the ones that drifted from corners at night, the ones that made visitors raise an eyebrow and villagers shrug helplessly. Every house had at least one odor no one could pinpoint. Was it a dead mouse under the floor? A forgotten turnip decomposing nobly in the rafters? A suspiciously damp pile of straw? Some problems were simply accepted, like death, taxes, and the smell of something rotting somewhere out of reach. Soot coated everything. It dusted blankets, darkened pottery, and turned every pale object into an accidental charcoal drawing. Children grew up gray-toned. Adults aged faster. Even bread rolls often had a smoky aftertaste. And medieval people shrugged through all of it like, well, that's just how homes are. If by miracle the house wasn't smoking, it was still drafty. Gaps in the walls made winter feel like living inside a wooden flute. Wind whistled through rooms with the confidence of a burglar. People slept in hats, mittens, cloaks, and occasionally with a warm brick wrapped in cloth, as if preparing to camp indoors. Despite all this, medieval families considered their homes cozy. And in a way, they were crowded, smoky, noisy, unpredictable, but familiar. These homes didn't just shelter people. They shaped them. They toughened lungs, built tolerance, and taught entire generations the fine art of ignoring smells until they stopped noticing them. So if you ever think your apartment has a weird draft, or your kitchen gets smoky, or your laundry smells faintly of damp socks, congratulations. You're living a life of unimaginable luxury. In the medieval house, the smoke hugged you, the mold befriended you, the animals judged you, and every scent told a story you absolutely did not want to hear. Cooking in the medieval world wasn't a gentle domestic activity. It was a full-contact sport played against fire, gravity, questionable ingredients, and whatever the weather felt like doing inside the house that day. You didn't prepare dinner, you survived it. Every meal began with a silent prayer, continued with a bit of chaos, and ended with someone coughing, someone burned, and someone saying, "It's edible," like a victory speech. The kitchen, if you could call it that, was usually the center of the house, a place where warmth was produced not by design, but by a fire pit that behaved like it had unresolved emotional issues. Flames danced, leapt, sputtered, soared, and occasionally lunged at you in what medieval people generously called normal hearth behavior. Everything cooked over this fire tasted like smoke, determination, and whatever fell in when you weren't looking. A fireplace had no safety guards, because those hadn't been invented. And even if they had, medieval villagers would have ignored them because a hearth guard slowed down the airflow, which was medieval logic, for we don't understand how fire works, but we trust it completely. Sparks shot out unpredictably. Logs shifted with the enthusiasm of toddlers. Hot embers rolled across the floor like flaming marbles, threatening feet, skirts, and domestic peace. Children were expected to hover near the flames, poking pots, fetching water, and learning how not to cry when sparks burned through their sleeves. They gained survival skills early, mostly because if you didn't learn how to dodge a flying ember by age 5, you were not going to make it to age 6. Mothers cooked with one hand while batting away stray animals, scolding toddlers, and adjusting pots. Those pots were often hanging from iron hooks that looked sturdy until you realized they were barely secured to beams darkened by so much soot they were one spark away from retirement. And the cauldrons, oh, the cauldrons. They were enormous, heavy, bubbling vats of stew that demanded respect. If one tipped over, and you didn't just worry about burns. You worried about losing half the village's weekly food in a single splash. People stood near them like nervous diplomats, watching their simmering contents with a mixture of hope and dread. A boiling cauldron was never just a dinner pot. It was a medieval mood swing balanced on iron legs. Explosions were not uncommon. Steam built up under lids. Pressure accumulated. If someone forgot to stir properly, the pot could hiss, rattle, and then erupt like a tiny culinary volcano. Medieval families learned to read these warning signs the way modern people read traffic lights. When the cauldron rattled, you didn't question it. You stepped back, grabbed a wooden spoon, and tried bargaining with the stew like it was a wild horse you hoped wouldn't kick you. Food poisoning was a weekly visitor, usually uninvited, always dramatic. People didn't refrigerate anything. They barely cooled things. Leftovers were judged by smell alone, and medieval noses were terrifyingly optimistic. The logic was simple. If it doesn't crawl away on its own, it's still good. If mold can be scraped off, the rest is edible. If the meat smells strange, then boil it longer. If it still smells strange, add more herbs. If it smells truly cursed, bury it and start over, preferably before someone tries to eat it anyway. Most meals were stews, for the simple reason that boiling things was the closest medieval families could get to sterilizing their food. Meat was rare, precious, and often questionable. When it appeared, it came salted so heavily it could be used as a weapon. People soaked it, scraped it, boiled it, and still ended up chewing it like slightly edible wood. Fresh meat was only available when an animal was slaughtered, at which point villagers rushed to consume it before it turned into what medieval people politely called dangerous. Vegetables were boiled into submission until they lost all their color, personality, and nutritional value. A pot of greens could start the day looking hopeful and end it looking like it had given up on all life pursuits. But they were safe-ish, and that was enough. Anything that grew underground was cherished, even if the roots sometimes came with worms who refused to evacuate before dinner. Medieval cooks simply shrugged and pretended not to notice. Bread was baked in communal ovens or on hot stones, and yes, it often came with bonus ingredients. A bit of ash here, a bit of soot there, and occasionally a piece of straw to add texture. People tore into loaves the consistency of small bricks, dipping them into everything because chewing them dry required jaw strength, usually reserved for blacksmiths and annoyed horses. Kitchen fires were common and terrifying. One wrong spark, one poorly placed log, one gust of indoor wind, and suddenly the entire house joined the cooking process. Families kept buckets of water nearby, though not always filled, because water was unpredictable and often shared with animals. When a fire broke out, everyone had a job. Adults threw water, children screamed, dogs barked, and cats sauntered out like they'd seen worse. Meals were served not with cutlery pride, but with the hope no one would get sick. People huddled around the hearth, bowls in hand, steam rising, eyes watering from smoke and heat. Every spoonful was a small gamble. Will this be delicious? Will this be fine? Will this ruin the next 3 days? There was no way to know. You ate, you prayed, you hoped the stew hadn't developed personality traits. Guests, however, pretended every meal was wonderful, because politeness was important, and complaining about food was a luxury far beyond mortal reach. If you traveled, you learned quickly to accept whatever was put in front of you, even if it looked like it was plotting its own escape. Hosts beamed proudly, saying things like, "It's my grandmother's recipe," while you quietly wondered if her grandmother had survived it. Despite all the chaos, medieval people loved the hearth. It was the center of the home, the giver of meals, the source of warmth. It was their comfort, their danger, their gathering place. Children curled up beside it, adults worked around it, animals lounged near it, and families lived by it. It was messy, unpredictable, and occasionally violent, but it was life. So the next time your kitchen fills with a bit of smoke because you left something in the oven, remember, at least your dinner won't explode. Your roof isn't dripping soot into your soup, and your pot isn't deciding whether to attack you tonight. Medieval cooking was 80% flames, 20% burns, and 100% chaos. And yet, families survived, laughed, ate, and lived to tell the tale, assuming the stew didn't get them first. Medicine in the medieval world wasn't so much healthcare as it was a series of increasingly questionable guesses delivered with absolute confidence. If you were sick, the village healer didn't reach for textbooks, charts, or anything remotely grounded in science. No, she or he, or occasionally the guy who owned the cleanest spoon, reached for herbs, charms, prayers, and ingredients that modern law enforcement would classify under multiple red flags. The garden was the medieval pharmacy, but not the peaceful, lavender-scented kind you're imagining. This was a patch of soil behind someone's cottage where herbs, weeds, and possibly forbidden plants waged silent war. Leaves drooped suspiciously. Roots stuck out like claws. Everything smelled either healing or poisonous, and the problem was, medieval people didn't always know which was which. But that never stopped them. They approached the garden like it was a treasure, chest full of hope, and also mildly cursed. Feeling a fever coming on? Someone would march straight to the herb patch and grab whatever looked mildly medicinal. Mint, thyme, fennel, mugwort, great. But then came the experimental extras. Crushed beetles for strength, moss scraped from church walls for holiness, or stale bread soaked in ale, because it worked on my cousin once. Sick children got potions brewed from roots, so bitter they questioned the meaning of life. Adults drank concoctions that smelled like the forest floor at its worst. Everybody prayed the dosage was correct, even though correct didn't exist yet. And then there were charms. Oh, the charms. Medieval people loved their charms the way modern people love wellness influencers. A charm wasn't just pretty, it was essential, especially if you wanted to avoid evil air, unbalanced humors, or anything involving the moon, which medieval people blamed for half of human suffering. You could wear a charm around your neck, tie it to your bedpost, tuck it into your clothing, or hide it in your shoe. Every charm came with a story. This protects against nightmares. This prevents fevers. This one stops invisible creatures from sitting on your chest at night. And people believed it, because when the world is confusing and plagues stroll through your town like uninvited guests, you hold on to anything that offers hope. Of course, charms alone weren't enough. For more serious ailments, you needed spells. Not flashy wizarding spells, more like whispered instructions, muttered over boiling water while someone stared intensely into a pot, hoping it would do something helpful. If a healer spoke in rhyme, added herbs while walking in a circle, or recited names of saints like she was reading a shopping list, no one questioned it. Because sometimes the spell worked, or the illness passed, or the patient survived unusually strong tea. In the medieval mind, all outcomes were evidence that the spell had been successful. And then there were the potions, the brews so notorious that even medieval people hesitated before drinking them. Some potions came from flowers and leaves, others from things with legs. Spiders, worms, snails, the occasional powdered tooth, a feather from a bird that had flown over a church, and always something slimy, because medieval logic insisted that slimy cures slimy. If your stomach turned just hearing the recipe, the healer would say, that means it's working already. But it wasn't just the garden that supplied remedies. The graveyard made a surprising number of cameos in medieval medicine. People believed the dead held secrets, and those secrets could be used for healing, if you were brave or desperate enough. Powdered skull was a popular remedy, supposedly excellent for headaches. A bit of bone dust mixed with wine was said to strengthen the weak. Moss scraped from tombstones helped with bleeding. And if someone had epilepsy, you might be advised to place their hand inside a freshly dug grave, because apparently terrifying the illness out of someone counted as medical treatment. And medieval people didn't blink. They accepted graveyard cures with the same calm resignation. They accepted taxes or sudden rainstorms, or the fact that soup was 50% ash on windy days. If someone said, drink this potion made from flower petals, honey, and the toe of a dead man, villagers nodded thoughtfully and replied, how many times a day? Travelers brought new medicines, too. Dried snakes from distant lands. Crushed gemstones that definitely did nothing except impress people. Exotic roots wrapped in cloth. Strange powders that smelled like disappointment. These were considered luxurious treatments, the medieval equivalent of imported skincare. Nobles swore by them, especially if they were rare, expensive, or sparkly. If a cure cost enough to bankrupt a household, they assumed it must be effective. Meanwhile, common people relied on whatever the healer could find, or whatever felt spiritually adjacent to health. A spoonful of honey for coughs. Garlic hung in doorways to ward off evil. Damp cloths on foreheads. Bread rubbed on warts and then fed to a dog, because somehow transferring your wart to a dog counted as medicine. If the dog ate it, your wart disappeared. If the dog didn't, villagers blamed the devil, or fate, or the fact that nothing in medieval life was simple. Sometimes healing rituals required group participation. Villagers gathered around the sick person, chanting, praying, or holding candles while the healer waved herbs over the bed like they were blessing a stew. Nobody questioned the process. The healer could say, we must open the window to let the sickness out, and people obeyed, even if opening the window meant letting in cold air, bad smells, or curious animals peeking in to see what the fuss was about. And through it all, people genuinely believed in the power of these treatments. Not because they understood how disease worked, they didn't. Not because they had scientific proof, didn't. But because generations of trial and error had convinced them that some things seemed to work. A tea that calmed fevers, a charm that brought comfort, a whispered spell that eased fear, a graveyard ingredient that, well, probably did nothing, but belief is a powerful painkiller. Sickness was terrifying, unpredictable, and everywhere, so people clung to whatever gave them the slightest bit of control. Gardens, charms, herbs, prayers, grave dust, moonlit rituals, it all blended together into a patchwork system of hope. A system built on survival, creativity, and sheer determination. They didn't have microscopes. They didn't know what bacteria was. They didn't understand infection or immunity. But they tried. They believed. They learned through mistakes, miracles, and occasional questionable decisions involving cemetery moss. And somehow, despite the graveyard potions, the questionable herbs, the chanting, the talismans, many survived. Not all, but enough to tell the tale. Enough to pass down their knowledge, their remedies, their charms. Enough to eventually build the world that would place guesswork with science. But back then, healing wasn't a profession. It wasn't a science. It wasn't even a method. It was a patchwork of fear, folklore, and flowers gathered at dawn. Medicine came from the garden, and the graveyard, and the wild, strange heart of the medieval world. And people trusted it, because when life is that uncertain, hope itself becomes the most powerful cure. If you lived in the medieval world, you didn't need a smartwatch, a therapist, or a neighborhood WhatsApp group, because you already had something far more intrusive, keeping tabs on your every move. The church. Not just the Sunday service version. Not just the prayer before bed version. No, this was the all-seeing, all-hearing, all-commenting on your life institution that managed morality, medicine, education, public behavior, private behavior, and if the rumors were spicy enough, your romantic activities too. The church wasn't just a place you visited. It was the air you breathed, the rules you followed, the judge you feared, and the counselor you never asked for, but absolutely could not avoid. From the cradle to the grave, the church shaped your days like a medieval life coach with unlimited authority and zero chill. Imagine waking up in the morning, and the first thing you hear is the church bell. You're not even fully conscious yet, and already someone is reminding you that time belongs to God. The bell controlled everything. When to pray, when to work, when to stop working, when to panic because the bell rang for a funeral, and everyone wondered whose sins finally caught up with them. Even meals were tied to bells. Hunger didn't decide your schedule, holiness did. And because medieval life wasn't confusing enough, every major decision required spiritual consultation. Feeling sick? Better go to the priest before the healer, because maybe your fever was actually caused by demons, bad thoughts, or forgetting to pray hard enough last Tuesday. Thinking of planting crops earlier this year? Not without the church calendar's approval. Otherwise you risked offending whichever saint was on duty that month. Wanting to get married? Prepare for premarital interviews, public bans, and the priest deciding whether your union was spiritually sound or just entertaining enough for the village to gossip about. Every milestone in life came stamped with ecclesiastical paperwork. Birth meant baptism. Marriage meant sacraments. Death meant funeral rites. If you didn't follow the script, your neighbors acted like you had personally scheduled a meeting with the devil. Even naming your child too creatively could land you on the suspicious behavior list. You couldn't name your kid Frog or Theobald the Mighty. It had to be something saintly and approved. Otherwise the church quietly wondered what you were plotting. But the church wasn't satisfied with controlling major life events. Oh no, It cared deeply about the little things too. Your thoughts, your habits, your conversations, your gossip. Especially the gossip. Medieval priests were the unofficial moderators of village drama. Confession wasn't just spiritual cleansing. It was the era's hottest data subscription. People confessed everything. Jealousy, gluttony, impure dreams, stealing a turnip, thinking uncharitable thoughts about Margaret, the suspicious neighbor. Priests knew who feuded with whom, who liked whom, who hated whom, and who owed whom money. And the villagers knew they knew. If a priest raised an eyebrow at you during Sunday Mass, the entire congregation stared at you like you'd been caught doing something scandalous, even if all you did was sneeze. The church's social power made every medieval village feel like a small-town group chat where the admin had absolute control and zero sense of boundaries. Education? That belonged to the church, too. If you wanted to learn to read, you had two choices: join a monastery or hope your parish priest had enough patience to teach the alphabet between sermons on the dangers of sin. Books were handwritten by monks, kept in locked chests, and treated like sacred relics. Knowledge wasn't something you casually acquired. It was rationed like holy treasure. And most of what was taught wasn't math or science or anything practical. It was scripture, hymns, and reminders that God was watching you make questionable choices. Medicine, yes. Somehow the church got involved here too. Not the herbs and beetles and questionable potions we've already covered, but the spiritual side of healing. Priests prescribed prayers, fasting, penance, and relics. Want to cure your illness? Touch this saint's bone fragment, or what someone claimed was a bone fragment. Drink water blessed under the right moon phase. Wear a charm with sacred words on it. Avoid certain foods on certain days, because holiness apparently had dietary requirements. And if you still weren't cured, well, maybe your sins were heavier than expected. The church's moral guidelines extended into every corner of daily life. What you could eat, what you could say, what jokes were acceptable, what hand gestures counted as sinful, whether dancing was joyful or a one-way invitation to demonic temptation, whether feasts were celebratory or dangerously indulgent. Even laughter was scrutinized. Too much laughter could signal pride, an unforgivable medieval offense. And your bedroom? Oh, absolutely monitored. The church had rules about intimacy that required entire manuals. When you were allowed to do it, how often, under what conditions, which positions were holy, which positions were sinful, and which positions were absolutely going to make an angel faint. Certain days of the week were forbidden. Certain times of year were forbidden. Certain moods were forbidden. It's a miracle medieval people had children at all. And if anyone broke the rules, penalties ranged from public embarrassment to outright penance. The phrase, "God knows what you did," hit differently when your priest likely did too. But the church didn't just enforce morality. It shaped public life and politics. Local priests had more influence than village leaders. Bishops negotiated with kings. Monasteries owned massive amounts of land. If a dispute arose over crops, animals, property lines, marriages, fights, the church settled it. Sometimes with fairness, sometimes with favoritism, sometimes by declaring God had spoken, even if God suspiciously shared the same opinion as the priest who wanted the bigger field. Every rumor, every scandal, every confession threaded back into the church's hands. The institution didn't just guide people, it collected data centuries before data collection had a name. And people accepted it because faith was the framework of their world. The church wasn't just a building. It was safety, community, afterlife insurance, crisis counseling, and the only organization that promised answers when nothing made sense. Even when people complained privately, they still showed up on Sunday, because not showing up was a declaration, a loud one that invited questions you didn't want asked. And so medieval people lived their lives beneath the steady gaze of stained glass windows, ringing bells, and priests who knew everything, sometimes more than they wanted to. The church was comfort, authority, protection, and pressure, all rolled into one towering force. It ruled minds as much as laws. It carved the rhythm of the week. It shaped identity, community, and morality. And yes, it controlled absolutely everything. If you picture medieval Europe as quiet farms, peaceful fields, and the occasional sleepy cow, let me gently correct that image before we go any further. Because the Middle Ages were not a serene pastoral painting. They were a live-action petting zoo that refused to close, full of animals that did not care about personal space, hygiene, or the concept of indoors. Medieval life meant animals everywhere. Not sometimes, not seasonally, always. And it wasn't cute. We are not talking about fluffy barnyard charm. We're talking about constant clucking, braying, mooing, squealing, nudging, shedding, chewing, and interrupting every activity humans attempted to do. You didn't just live with animals. You cohabited with them in ways that modern people would call a health code violation, a lawsuit, and a trauma bonding experience all at once. Start with chickens. Chickens did not stay in coops like polite domesticated birds. They went wherever they pleased, which usually meant directly under your bed, under your table, under your dress, or into your pantry if they felt adventurous. Every medieval home had at least one chicken wandering around like it owned the place. It pecked at crumbs, laid surprise eggs in laundry baskets, and announced sunrise whether or not the sun actually agreed. If you woke up and didn't immediately see a chicken, you assumed it was plotting something. And then there were pigs. Pigs didn't stay in pens. Pens were optional. Pigs roamed the streets freely, trotting through markets, nudging strangers, stealing food, and aggressively minding everyone's business. Medieval towns were full of loud, snorting, surprisingly athletic pigs who knocked children over, chewed on unattended boots, and occasionally interrupted church services by barging through the front door like unruly toddlers demanding snacks. Imagine sitting in a medieval tavern, sipping your questionable ale, when a pig casually strolls past your table and steals someone's carrot. No one reacts. No one even looks up. This wasn't odd. It was Tuesday. Cows were no better. They wandered through narrow alleys like massive horned traffic jams. A cow might block your door. A cow might block the road. A cow might stick its head inside your home to see what you were cooking or steal hay from your storage like an entitled neighbor. People didn't shoo them. You couldn't. It was a cow. If it wanted to stand in the middle of the only street leading to the market, well, nature had spoken. Dogs were absolutely everywhere, too. Not domesticated pets the way we know them, more like semi-employed, freelancing creatures who assisted with guarding, herding, begging, and occasionally joining villagers for dinner like they'd been invited. Medieval dogs were part companion, part security alarm, part street committee. They wandered through kitchens, dining halls, barns, and even castles, eating scraps, chasing thieves, barking at wind, and sleeping anywhere they liked, including right in front of your feet while you tried to avoid stepping on them in the dark. Meal times? A festival of paws. Dogs waited under tables. Cats perched on beams. Goats poked their heads through open doors hoping to be included. And yes, cows sometimes wandered by just to sniff the stew and moo their judgment. Medieval people accepted this as normal. And speaking of goats were chaotic neutrals. If a goat lived in your village, it believed everything belonged to it. Clothesline? Goat. Vegetable patch? Goat. Rope? Goat now. And if your back was turned long enough, it would be inside your home trying to eat your broom. Medieval goats were agents of chaos, and no one bothered controlling them. Horses clattered through towns like they were delivering royal decrees with every hoofbeat. They tied up traffic, startled pedestrians, and occasionally relieved themselves in the middle of walkways, while villagers politely walked around the steaming obstacle as if nothing had happened. In some homes, horses even peeked their heads through windows to beg for treats or stick their noses into cooking pots. Sheep wandered around like bewildered clouds with legs. They grazed on everything, including things not meant to be grazed, and bleated loudly whenever a human tried to concentrate, sleep, pray, or speak. Medieval people accepted sheep noise as a lifestyle. Silence didn't exist, just a constant soundtrack of animal commentary. Now mix all these creatures into the same space. Picture a medieval street. Dogs wrestling, pigs squealing, chickens scattering, geese honking like winged security guards, horses trotting, cows blocking the road, goats stomping on anything left unattended, cats slipping through windows, and ducks just vibing. All happening in the same 5-minute window. This wasn't an accident. This was everyday life. Medieval towns didn't separate human zones from animal zones because such a concept didn't exist. Everything was shared property roads, homes, food, beds, water, space. Inside homes, the situation didn't improve. Nights were a chorus of bleats, squeaks, rustles, clucks, and the occasional alarming thud from a creature whose body was not designed to climb onto furniture, but tried anyway. Families went to sleep knowing full well that at least one chicken, 2 cats, a mouse family, and the neighbor's dog would wander in at some point. Doors didn't lock. Most homes didn't even have proper doors. If you were wealthy enough, maybe you didn't sleep with livestock. But even castles had animals wandering around like unpaid interns. Dogs sprawled in kitchens, horses lingered in courtyards, falcons perched indoors, cats hunted mice in dining halls, and peacocks strutted around like feathered aristocrats who owned the place. Even royal banquets had animals weaving around guests' ankles, under the table, waiting for scraps or opportunities to steal entire pieces of meat if the moment felt right. And with all these creatures came all the noises, smells, and surprises you'd expect from a society that believed nature and civilization were the same space. Every step outdoors risked stepping in something. Every trip through the market meant dodging animals larger than you. Every morning began with a choir of barnyard symphonies performing at full volume. Medieval people didn't question any of this. They didn't know a world where animals stayed in tidy fenced areas, or had special barns, or were limited by zoning laws. Animals were companions, workers, intruders, neighbors, and roommates. They were everywhere, all the time, participating in every moment of medieval life with a confidence only animals can have. To a medieval villager, seeing a chicken hop onto the dinner table wasn't strange. Seeing a pig walk into church wasn't alarming. Seeing a goat steal someone's laundry wasn't noteworthy. It was just part of the background noise of a world fully shared between humans and the animals that lived beside them. And honestly, medieval animals behaved like they owned the place, because in many ways, they did. If you've ever fantasized about living in a medieval village because it seems peaceful, simple, or quiet, let me gently break that illusion before you start packing your imaginary burlap tunic. Because medieval Europe had no quiet. Not sometimes. Not occasionally. Not during the night or on holy days. Never. Not once. Not for a second. Silence simply did not exist. Not as a concept. Not as a luxury. Not as an achievable dream. Medieval life was a non-stop noise festival that made modern city traffic sound like a spa playlist. You didn't rest in the Middle Ages. You survived sound. Mornings began with roosters, and I don't mean poetic crowing at sunrise. Medieval roosters were broken. They crowed at midnight, at 2 a.m., at 3:17 a.m., whenever they felt threatened, excited, confused, or slightly hungry. They crowed because another rooster crowed. They crowed because someone walked past them too quickly. They crowed because existing was stressful. And since every household had multiple chickens roaming around unsupervised, the dawn chorus started hours before dawn. Then came the bells. Church bells, market bells, alarm bells. Bells for prayer, bells for meetings, bells for warnings, bells for reasons no one could actually remember. Bells rang so often that medieval people treated them like background weather loud, unpredictable, and capable of interrupting every thought you tried to have. If you lived near a church, the bell tower didn't just mark your day. It yelled it at you. And if the roosters and bells didn't jolt you awake, your neighbors would. Medieval homes had walls that might as well have been made of wet crackers. Every sound carried. Your neighbor grinding grain? You heard it. Your neighbor arguing? You heard every word. Your neighbor's baby crying? Congratulations. You are now emotionally invested in that child's sleep schedule. Even at night, someone somewhere was coughing, snoring, muttering prayers, stoking the fire, scolding a goat, or simply shifting on a straw mattress loud enough to trigger a chain reaction of more noises. Step outside in the morning, and you walked into a medieval symphony. Vendors shouted their goods like auctioneers fighting for dominance. Eels, fresh eels. Bread, some of IT, still good. Turnips, possibly turnips. They shouted because no one could hear anything otherwise. Markets were chaos animals bleating, carts rattling, pots clanging, voices overlapping, the whole place buzzing with the sonic energy of 1,000 stressed individuals trying not to get trampled. And speaking of carts, those things were unbelievably loud. Wooden wheels on cobblestone didn't roll. They thundered. Every cart was a portable earthquake. Every horse added hooves clacking, snorting, huffing occasional panicked whinnies if a goose got too bold. Wheels creaked, axles groaned, and when the wagon hit a patch of mud or manure, and it always did, you heard a chorus of curses that echoed across the village. Subtlety was not a medieval virtue. Then there were the drunks. Medieval alehouses didn't close on time. They closed when people passed out, which meant every night featured at least one man stumbling down the street, singing a song with only 2 words, yelling at invisible enemies, or loudly arguing with a barrel. And every argument ended the same way. A crash, a groan, and a villager saying something like, "Leave him. He'll get up eventually." Fights broke out constantly too. Medieval conflict resolution worked like this. Someone bumped someone else, someone spilled something, someone insulted someone's sheep, and suddenly the entire street turned into a spectator sport. Wooden cups were thrown. Shouts erupted. Neighbors leaned out of windows for a better view. People did not whisper disputes, they performed them. The whole town heard everything. And if conflict didn't fill your day with sound, entertainment did. Musicians played lutes badly. Jugglers announced themselves loudly enough to spook livestock. The town crier roamed around shouting news that everyone already knew. Festivals involved drums, horns, dancing, singing, and general shrieking. Weddings were loud. Funerals were loud. Even reading scripture sometimes involved dramatic yelling. The countryside wasn't quiet either. Wolves howled. Dogs barked at wolves. Shepherds yelled at dogs. Crows screamed their godforsaken crow screams. Frogs croaked. Wind rattled shutters. Branches scraped roofs. And occasionally, a fox screamed in the night, a sound so horrifying medieval villagers were convinced it was demons dragging someone to hell. Nighttime did not help. Forget peaceful darkness. Medieval nights were a symphony of creaking houses, restless animals, coughing neighbors, squealing pigs, stomping cows, whispering winds, and the unsettling noises of unseen creatures that absolutely existed because your imagination said so. And every sound mattered because every sound could mean danger, fire, thieves, wolves, sickness, so you never fully relaxed. Even monasteries, supposedly tranquil spaces, were loud. Monks snored in communal halls. Chanting began before sunrise. Bells rang constantly. Someone was always coughing, shifting, or accidentally knocking something over during prayer. Silence was a religious ideal, not a reality. You didn't meditate in peace. You meditated while someone in the next room sharpened a knife, fed a goat, or loudly told a child to stop licking the wall. Even sleep wasn't quiet. People groaned in their dreams. Infants wailed. Dogs barked at shadows. Rats scurried. Someone, somewhere, was always awake, always doing something, always noisy. And through all of it, medieval people just carried on not because they liked noise, but because they didn't know life without it. Quiet wasn't a thing you missed, because it wasn't a thing that existed. Rest wasn't peaceful. It was simply the moment you were tired enough to stop caring about the chaos buzzing around you. To live in medieval times was to live inside constant sound. A world without silence, without pause, without the luxury of quiet moments. A place where rest wasn't earned by calm. It was earned by exhaustion. And that, more than anything else, might be the medieval experience you'd struggle with the most. Not the dirt, not the danger, not the food, not the hygiene, the noise. The endless, inescapable noise. Death wasn't a visitor in the Middle Ages. It wasn't a rare event, a whispered topic, or something people avoided thinking about until old age. No death lived inside the medieval world like an extra member of the household. It stood behind every door, lingered in every field, drifted in the corners of every room. People didn't fear it the way we do now. They simply accepted it, the same way one accepts rain, taxes, or that one neighbor who definitely shouldn't be in charge of anything, but somehow is. You woke up and death was already part of your day. Cough in the night could turn into a funeral by morning. A simple cut could be lethal. A fever didn't run its course, it ran you. Childhood wasn't a guarantee. Adulthood was an achievement. And old age was so rare, people treated elders like mystical creatures who somehow outsmarted the universe. And funerals? They weren't grand, solemn affairs with floral arrangements and a slideshow of memories. They were fast, urgent, practical. The body needed to be buried quickly because medieval homes were warm in all the wrong ways, and medicine was mostly composed of hope and herbs. If someone died, the village reacted with the efficiency of people who had done this 100 times already. They washed, wrapped, carried, prayed, and moved on. Grief was real, but lingering sorrow was a luxury nobody had time for. Children saw death constantly. They saw it in neighbors, in livestock, in playmates, in the fields. Medieval parents tried to shield them, but life did not. You could be picking berries one day and attending a burial the next. Children helped dig graves. They watched parish priests bless bodies. They grew up with the steady knowledge that nothing, not youth, not health, not goodness, guaranteed safety. And adults weren't spared the anxiety. Every season came with its own version of danger. Winter brought starvation. Spring brought disease. Summer brought fevers and bad water. Autumn brought injuries from harvest work or accidents no one could afford to treat. For medieval people, each season was like a different boss level, each with its own threats and no cheat codes. When someone traveled, even just to the next village, there was always a small chance they wouldn't return. Roads were unpredictable, forests were dangerous, and the human body was fragile enough that slipping on wet stone could end you. That's why farewells were emotional, but understated. Everyone knew that every goodbye might be the last, but nobody wanted to say it out loud. And yet, somehow, people didn't walk around terrified all the time. They were matter-of-fact about it. Death was woven into the rhythm of life. Villagers talked about it over dinner, joked about it in taverns, and prayed about it daily. It shaped their gratitude. Every safe return, every healthy birth, every morning without tragedy felt like a small victory. Not a miracle necessarily, just a quiet moment the universe allowed them to have. It also shaped how they built their communities. Medieval villages had graveyards at their centers, right next to the church, where everyone passed through daily. Children played near headstones. Animals grazed near them. Lovers met near them. The dead weren't hidden away. They were part of the neighborhood. Every name on a grave was someone's memory, someone's story, someone who had once carried water, tended fields, quarreled with neighbors, laughed at festivals. People didn't pretend death wasn't coming. They planned for it. They wrote wills with urgency, even the poor. Most wills read something like, "A cloak, a spoon, my blessings, and may God forgive the things I did on feast days." And they meant it. Medieval spirituality wasn't gentle, it was intense, reminding people constantly that death wasn't the end, but certainly wasn't simple. Still, life carried on. Farmers planted crops, knowing they might not be the one to harvest them. Parents had children, knowing they might not watch them grow. Lovers married, knowing life didn't promise time. And maybe that was the strange gift. Buried inside the hardship living became sharper, fuller, because nothing was guaranteed. Death wasn't always tragic to them. Sometimes it was expected. Sometimes it was merciful. And sometimes people responded to it with the practical calm of those who had seen too much to be shocked anymore. Stories of ghosts, spirits, and restless souls spread because people genuinely sensed the thinness between here and whatever came after. Night watchmen claimed to hear footsteps near fresh graves. Farmers avoided certain paths after sunset. Children whispered about wandering spirits in the fields, not because they liked fear, but because they lived beside the dead every day. And yet, medieval people held on to hope with a stubbornness that feels almost heroic. They planted gardens, they sang songs, they celebrated feast days with wild joy, partly because life was short, and partly because joy felt like rebellion against the darkness lurking around the edges. The festivals were loud, the dancing chaotic, the drinking enthusiastic, because you never knew how many festivals were left. Traveling performers turned sorrow into stories. Priests turned loss into ritual. Families turned fear into togetherness. And each small act of living became a declaration. Not today. Death stood behind them, but life pushed ahead anyway. It's strange to think how casual medieval people were about mortality, but maybe they had to be. When the world is unpredictable, you learn to appreciate even the dull days, the simple days, the days where nothing horrifying happens. You learn to treasure laughter as if it were sacred. You learn to hold loved ones close without expecting forever. And somewhere in that acceptance is a kind of wisdom we forget, we who live in a world padded with safety nets and medicine and alarms and comfort. Medieval people didn't choose their world, but they learned to walk through it with courage, humor, superstition, and a kind of resilience that feels almost unreal now. Death followed them like a constant shadow, but life, messy, loud, exhausting, stubborn life, kept going anyway. And maybe that's the most medieval thing of all.